Good evening. I'm Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board, and this is the regular meeting of the Select Board for May 26, 2020. This meeting, as all meetings during this health emergency, is being held remotely. We're using the WebEx events platform, and this meeting is being recorded. A quorum of the Select Board is participating from their respective remote locations. So let's start off with announcements and updates. We had a virtual Memorial Day event yesterday, which was fitting. I and some others spoke in front of the War Memorial with proper social distancing and masks, of course. And the event was recorded by BIG and then played later in the evening. In my speech, I quoted Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said, "Those who have long enjoyed such privileges as we enjoy forget in time that men have died to win them." I think that quote describes why it is important for us to have remembrance events such as the Memorial Day event we had yesterday, even during a health emergency or other difficult times. It's easy to forget those who died if all we have on Memorial Day are cookouts and binge TV. An event such as this reminds us that there's more to the day. And in the event, we all recognize not just the soldiers who have died in combat, but also those people who are fighting for us by fighting against the COVID virus in the hospitals, in the grocery stores, in the janitorial cabinets, delivering mail, delivering packages, and otherwise making it possible for the rest of us to survive through this crisis. So I hope we all continue to remember all the people who are fighting for us one way or another. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we have our economy opening up, and the weather is beautiful, and you know that that is a formula for bad things. So I think it's important that we all continue what we've been doing in Brookline, and that is protecting ourselves against the COVID virus by proper hand washing, of course, which shouldn't stop at the end of this emergency, but also wearing facial coverings, keeping social distances, and generally being careful as we interact with other people. We have been successful in keeping the transmission of this virus relatively low here in Brookline, not so much outside of Brookline, but still we need to keep struggling here in town and hope that outside municipalities also follow our guide in terms of how to prevent the spread of this disease. So those are my two comments. I was wondering if anyone else on the Select Board have any updates or announcements or comments they'd like to make. Ms. Heller, is that?
I'll make my usual census pitch. As I told you last week, our committee had a session with Ray Bennett, who is a census representative. And he was, as a result of that, we learned that in a southern tract in Brookline, the response rate was not as good as the rest of the town. I told you about that. And he called me very excited because within 2 days, the response rate had improved. While it's still not as good as the rest of the town, it's much better. And so I would urge people in that part of town and all over town to keep up the good work, increasing our numbers of self-response. Our number compared to the state, and we're at 58.2%, and the state rate is 62.2. So if we want to bring those federal dollars into Brookline, and we do, I believe every one of us shares that goal, please pay attention to the census. 2020census.gov is the web address. So go do it, Brookline.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Haller. That's also a good sign that people listen to the select board meetings and are responsive to things that we say. Anyone else?
I would just like to take the opportunity to urge people, if they haven't done so already, to request a mail-in ballot. Time is of the essence, because you need to allow the town clerk's office to be able to mail you a ballot, and then you'll need to mail it back. So we've got, I think, 2 weeks today when the election is going to be held. So just wanted to give that plug.
Great, thank you. Very important. Anyone else?
Sure, very briefly. Usual plug, safety net. It's doing well, could be doing better though. And I want to encourage everyone to give at brooklinecommunity.org to the Safety Net Fund to make sure that as this crisis continues, it may not feel like it's a crisis in the same way, because things are starting to open up. But remember, there is the health crisis, and then there is the economic crisis that's occurring. And the economic crisis will last at least as long as the health crisis, and likely much, much further than that. So anything you can do to help those in Brookline in need, I'd encourage you to do so. I also wanted to mention 2 other things. One is that I got a chance to see Chairman Green's speech at Memorial Day from yesterday. If you haven't seen it yet, I really encourage you to find on the big YouTube page that speech and give it a listen. I thought it was appropriate. I thought it was meaningful. I thought it was I thought it was exactly what we needed at the time. So I just wanted to applaud the chair for that speech and to encourage others to find it and to watch it.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing I want to say is, I'm sitting here after having sort of been following the story of a man in Minneapolis whose name is yet to be released. Who was killed by officers there in Minneapolis, a Black man. I probably don't have to tell you, frankly, who had an officer with his knee on this man's neck and effectively choked him to death. We've been following the stories of Ahmaud Arbery, of course, and recently a man in New York who had a woman police call the police on him for attempting to remind her of the leash law in Central Park. And as we watched on video, she was saying that he was attacking her or was coming near her, and he was doing nothing of the sort. It is a reminder as we have these conversations about racial equity, whether they be related to our budget, whether they be related to any issues of equity within our own community, which is by and large safe and has been protected from many of these issues to date, is that for many folks, this is not an academic exercise. It is an existential exercise. And I just it's a sad reminder, but I wanted to just remind us as more and more conversations about racial equity come up, is that the stakes are so much higher for some of us in this dialogue, in this conversation, and in these efforts. And as we move forward, just to remember that, and during a time of remembrance, of course, to remember those who are lost to this kind of horrific violence that I hope we never see in a community like ours. So it's been on my mind, and I felt like I wanted to share it as part of this opening. So thank you for allowing me to do that.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Anyone else? Mr. Franco, you're the only one left. No pressure. Okay, let's move on. Devin, do we have any public comments? I understand we do have a number of public comments.
Yes, so the first person who has signed up for public comment is Eric Hyatt, and I'm going to make him a panelist. Hi, Eric, you've been promoted.
Oh, thank you. I don't know, I can't see myself, but I'm going to trust that I'm somewhat visible.
No, it looks like you have not enabled your video, but your audio is working.
All right, let me just click on myself. Okay, well, it seems that I may not be able to join by video today. As long as you can hear me, is that okay?
Your words are more important than your face, Eric.
Thank you, Chair. I first want to acknowledge a great loss this week. The COVID pandemic claimed a life of someone very important to the town of Brookline, which was a man named Dave Moore. Dave was the math teacher in School Within a School, SWS. He taught generations of Brookline students who had, like me, been having issues with math. And I came into Dave's class, and I came in like with an F, where I was in Brookline High School math, and Dave turned me around and made me an A student in math. And he did that with compassion. He did that with wit and charm. And he was a really, really important part of the fabric of Brookline High School, and especially School Within a School, for a really long time. Dave died due to COVID 5 days ago, and the SWS community is absolutely grief-stricken by his loss. So I just want to acknowledge that Dave's contributions to Brookline, and also the devastating impact of COVID. Just a word about the pandemic. This is a worldwide disaster that we're in the middle of. It's a health disaster, and it's an economic disaster. That word disaster is one that I keep using, because when you say disaster, people think a hurricane or a tornado, and they're ready with that outpouring of like tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of aid that would be required. I think that Brookline will slide through 2020 okay, but 2021 could be a bloodbath for us, economically speaking. And it's devastating right now to members of our community. I think there may be as much as 20% unemployment in Brookline, and people I know are struggling with food and shelter and health and safety. So while I feel safe enough to make these comments, there's others in the town that are really struggling. So I'm urging the select board to please think about how much it would require to make the town safe. Is it $10 million, $50, $100 million? I would like to request respectfully that the select board tee up a public hearing about the budget, so we can really identify the devastating impact and try to address this for what it is, the disaster that it is. That's pretty much it. I'm very concerned about the impact on public education, on health and safety especially. I know these are really complex issues, but I'd like the board to make sure to recognize when we say reopening, we're still not yet even beginning to feel the economic impacts of this disaster on our community. That's it for my comment today. Thank you.
Thank you. And could you circulate to the select board, and we can circulate beyond, information on Mr. Marr? Is it Mr. Marr? David Marr?
Dave Moore, M-O-O-R-E.
Oh, M-O, okay. I think it's important for people to see or put a face to the losses that we're suffering as a result of the COVID virus. And Mr. Moore sounds like someone who made a huge difference, not only in your lives, but probably in the lives of many, many people. And his loss is more than just someone who passed away. It's someone whose presence is no longer able to provide education and other things to the town that he was providing when he was alive. But so if you can send us information, that would be great. And in terms of budget hearings, we always have budget hearings when the budget is available. So,
thank you, Bernard. I'll send that information.
That should be coming up. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Ms. Williams, who's next?
The next person for public comment is Deborah Brown. Deborah, you have been promoted, and you can unmute yourself and enable your video if you feel comfortable.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start my presentation also on a somber note. Nathan Spritz's father passed away, and the service will be held tonight. His dad's Neil Spritz, and the service is at Temple Obe Shalom this evening. So I just wanted to let people know about that.
Thank you. We all know Nathan, and we should convey our condolences to him and his family.
Yeah,
I assume it's not COVID related.
No, his dad had been ill for a while. I talked with him months ago, and Nathan was down in Florida taking care of his dad, so he'd been sick for a while. I can't speak as to the ultimate cause of his passing,
Right.
but I know that he had been in failing health. So, but
It sounds like at least he had members of his family near him in his final days, which is something that many people don't have in this COVID virus. So that's one thing to be thankful for.
well, Nathan's been loyal to Brookline, so I know that a lot of folks would want to know. So I just wanted to.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say it. So I wanted to shift gears. And I wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Jett. I'm not sure he's going to mention this or not. The antibodies work that he's been doing, last Thursday, I was on a call, and apparently the work that he's been doing with MGH sort of very quickly broke the mold for efficiency. A lot of the communities that have been doing sampling, it has lacked just the level of efficiency, timeliness, smoothness in terms of getting the testing taken, etc., the whole process. So kudos to Dr. Jett. Apparently MGH, Dr. Jett will be writing this up in terms of best practices. The political scientist in me started drooling because, when you start talking about how do you get more resources to do more sampling, well, first of all, you've got to get government to understand how do you do it efficiently. And if you can say, this is how we did it efficiently, then sometimes you can convince other communities that there's an easier way to do it. And most representatives come from suburban communities. There's sometimes a way in. So hats off to the fire department, the police department, and to Dr. Jett and his folks for coordinating this. But it sounds like, to use the baseball metaphor, it was a grand slam. So.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Jett's on the in the meeting. So hats off to you, Dr. Jett. And another example of how we're so lucky to have you during this terrible crisis. So
I wasn't sure Dr. Jett was going to toot his horn about this, but I just wanted to be clear that this was something that when the folks at MGH start saying this is something that they have not seen anywhere, that I wanted to be clear that this was a big deal. And, that's rare air to be able to say that. So I want, in 30 seconds or more, about 30 seconds, I wanted to cover two other very quick things. One, I have a really quick question. Why don't we have a system that our phones are forwarded to town employees? So rather than people picking up their calls and then calling people that call the town, why aren't the calls just immediately forwarded to town employees so that it saves a step? And the other concept that I want to pitch the idea of just bring up the idea of budget morality, and just really that we have to hone in on just making sure that our budget focuses in on vulnerable populations, and not just in terms of verbiage, but that there's money, and not just the way that Ronald Reagan talked about it and George Bush, 1,000 points of light. It should not be, the NGO community paying for it or community development block grant, but it should be town dollars, our own budget, real dollars, being the bedrock of our safety net. So I just wanted to say that. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you. Okay, Devin, I understand that there's one other person.
So the third person who sent in a public comment, I don't think actually wanted to speak tonight, but it was just about implementing the overnight parking ban.
Okay. We're going to have a discussion on that later on, I believe. And could you just circulate his email to the select board?
Yes, I will. Okay. And, you know, we have about 30 people at the meeting currently. I don't see anyone's hand raised, and I don't have any private chats.
Great. Thank you. Let's move on then. Question of approving the minutes of May 19, 2020. I had a few edits. Anyone else have edits that you provided to Ms. McGalvery? Okay, I move approval of the minutes of May 19, 2020. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Next, question of approving a washer extractor equipment grant from the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security and the Department of Fire Services from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the amount of $5,000 for the Brookline Fire Department. Any explanation for this, Wagner?
Mr. Chairman, this is Chief Sullivan.
Oh, hi, Chief Sullivan.
I want to take one second, if I may, to thank Ms. Brown for her comments. It was an incredible job by the members of the Emergency Operations Center as well as the Public Health Department to do that testing that we did up at Los Angeles Park. And I know I got a chance late in the meeting last week to thank them, but now that we're earlier in the meeting, I want to make sure that more people could hear how well their Emergency Operations Center performed. So thank you for that. The extractor grant was a state-funded grant that allows for fire departments across the state to continue the good work that we've been doing for decontamination of our personal protective equipment. When the new training facility was contemplated, there was no grant, or there was no idea of the extractor being put into that facility. And so when this grant came along, we conferred with our budget folks, Melissa and Justin, for the matching funds. And we were lucky enough to be awarded a $5,000 grant so that we could put a new extractor into the training facility for our training staff, which does a lot of work in the burn building. And obviously their turnout gear gets soiled very easily, as well as the recruits that we will have going through in the future. So that grant was applied for just prior to the COVID-19, but in consultation with our budget analysis and public safety business, we do have the funding to meet our match, which is about another $4,000.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the board? So I move approval of question of approving a washer extractor equipment grant from the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security and the Department of Fire Services from the Commonwealth worth $5,000. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller? Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye. Sorry, I was muted.
No problem. And chair votes aye. Next, question of approving thank you, Chief Sullivan. Question of approving a grant from the Brookline Community Foundation in the amount of $2,500 for the Brookline Police Department's Community Service Division to support the Summer Youth Program. Is Chief Lipson in the meeting?
Kevin Maskell is here. Kevin, I've just unmuted you. So if you want to try speaking now, introducing yourself and moving forward.
Okay. Good evening. Kevin Maskell from the Public Safety Business Office. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. This award will support the Summer Youth Program, assuming we have it for the summer. And the program will provide leadership, team building, positive and healthy relationships among the youth and law enforcement within the Brookline community. The participants will be in grades 7th and 8th and will be recruited from the Brookline community programs, programs such as the Brookline Teen Center, Step to Success, the Food Pantry Thrive program, and Brookline Housing. The period of performance is from August. Actually, the period of performance, the project ends 5/31/2020. So we're in conversations now to see if we can get allowed to do a fall program if the summer program doesn't come into place.
Okay, any questions?
Just only, is that a program that needs to happen? Is that a program that can happen virtually or in some like hybrid format that might allow it to go on as planned?
That's a good question. We're still in the process. I mean, that's something we can look at, but we're not 100% sure.
Okay.
Okay, so we're approving a grant, and the details of the program will evolve over time. I take it.
Yes, sir.
I don't think there's any problem with that. Okay, any other questions? I move approval of the question of approving a grant from the Brookline Community Foundation in the amount of $2,500 for the Brookline Police Department's Community Service Division to support the summer youth program. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller? Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
Ms. Heller? Ms. Heller? Okay, maybe she stepped away. Chair votes aye. Ms. Heller? Okay. Chair votes. Pardon me? Okay. Chair votes aye. Moving on. Question of approving the pedestrian and bicyclist safety grant in the amount of $4,200 from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety and Security for the Brookline Police Department. Who is presenting that?
Kevin Maskell again.
Hello. Okay. Tell us about this and what you're going to use the money for.
All right. This grant will utilize pedestrian and bicyclist data to identify specific locations and times of day to ensure safety laws as it relates to motorists, pedestrians, and bicyclists. The information of actually finding out where we would do the stops are, the crime analyst for the Department of the Police will take data and then disperse it out to the person who's administering the grant.
Any questions from the board?
I was just going to say, no, kudos to the police and fire departments for continuing to go after these grants, which, you know, provide important data to the town and provide important services to the town. And I think it's a good model going forward is going after these kinds of grants that really help us out. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, move approval of the pedestrian and bicyclist safety grant in the amount of $4,200 from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
I'm back. Hi. And I vote yes on the prior matter.
Okay.
Video connection problem.
We all have those problems. So are you voting yes on this?
Yes, I am.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
Is that aye?
Aye, yes, sir.
Okay. And chair votes aye. Okay, next. Question of approving the mobile food truck application. I'm sorry. Question of approving the following police department budget transfer from personnel full-time. Apparently there's a vacancy, I assume, to traffic and parking for online transactions in the amount of $50,000. Okay, and Mr. Masco, you presenting that?
Yes, sir. This transfer will basically fund the town's online transaction convenience fees, which is associated with their parking ticket collection. So the budget, when the budget was put together last year, we assumed we were going to pass the fees on to the customer. but they ran into a conversion issue with the software package. So the result took longer than we anticipated. So the result, we had more expenses than we anticipated. It's been resolved in March, and going forward, we won't have this issue.
Okay. Okay, so this is for what, updating the software or buying new software?
Well, it's to pay the online transaction fees. The software that we were trying to purchase would have eliminated the fees, but it didn't work in time. That's what it was.
Okay, so I get it. Okay, any questions from the board? I move approval of the following police department budget transfer from full-time personnel to traffic and parking for online transactions, $50,000. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Next, question of approving the mobile food truck application for Stoked Pizza, Brookline, doing business as Stoked Pizza, wood-fired pizza at the parking lot of 1632 Beacon, Brookline. Hours of operation, Friday and Saturday from 5 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. Now, there was a question as to whether we needed a public hearing on this, and I think that the conclusion was that we don't, but I'd like to make this a time-specific temporary approval, maybe till the end of August, so that if there are issues that the local community has, we have a chance to revisit this then. I do not think that this emergency is going to be over by the end of this summer, so we might as well, create an opportunity to revisit this if necessary at the end of the summer. Any objections to that? No? Any questions about this?
Mr. Chair, this is Mel Kleckner. My understanding of this request is there won't be sales taking place in this mobile truck. This mobile truck will effectively be an adjunct to the kitchen, and it will allow Stoke to produce more food for delivery. And given the restrictions on the COVID-19 and right now, at least the curbside collection or the curbside delivery. So I do believe that they are planning to just make pizzas and have those delivered from that location. There won't be any transactions made, as far as I know, at the mobile food truck.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I move approval of the mobile food truck application for Stoked Pizza, wood-fired pizza at the parking lot of 1632 Beacon Street, hours Friday and Saturday from 5 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Okay, moving into the real meat of this meeting.
Pardon me, just Mr. Chair, just before you move on, that vote, I assume, included that condition you proposed of expiring on August 31st?
Correct. I apologize. I should have mentioned it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, next, annual town meeting warrant articles, joint public hearing with the school committee. So we're going to have a presentation, and I assume someone from the school committee is ready to present that or make that presentation. At around, 6 o'clock, the school committee will join us. They'll convene in a joint meeting, and we will move on to questions and answers from the select board and the school committee and from the public as our public hearing. So who's teeing up this presentation?
Let me say that it's the project team who will be making the presentation.
Okay.
I saw Andy Felix, and there he is, Andy Felix, a minute ago. Ray Masak should be here. If you could promote also the George Cole, who is co-chair of the project, Susan Wolf Dickoff, another co-chair. We have the architect is here, Andrew Jonick. Looking at the list, and and Jonathan Simpson, staff, and Gina Franconi, and I believe Melissa Goff is here as well. So if you could promote those folks, I would appreciate it.
And the issue before the board that we're asking the presenters to discuss is basically the question of why we need an additional appropriation for this project.
Right.
So.
Okay, let me just give a brief introduction.
Okay.
And basically, this is a story of how we began way back in 2016 or 17 with a complicated BHS renovation project, which estimated to have cost between $270 million and $348 million. That seemed not so palatable. So we worked to bring the cost down to 205.6 by using a different but also complex scheme involving the MBTA and the Cypress building at 111 Cypress. In the interim between 2018, when we went to town meeting, market conditions of galloping escalation and also the complexities of the MBTA have caused significant budget challenges, and we'll go into that in a minute. On the other hand, that's the not so great news. And then the great news is that bond interest rates have significantly declined. So that bottom line is that by adding the $32 million in bonds to the project will still result in a project that is basically cost neutral to the voters. Because when you do a project like this, you're taking the bond cost, the interest cost, you're adding them together, and you're forecasting the impact. And that impact will be the same because the bond interest rates have just declined, even though the bond pot of money bucket would go up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and ask Andy Felix to put the slide presentation. Can you all see it?
Yep.
This is a slide presentation that we made to the, we've doctored it a few times to cut it down basically in size. And we made it to, we talked about it at the advisory committee subcommittee hearing last week, and we further cut it so that we understand time is of a limitation. So, Andy, next slide. We want to discuss the current project status and then the budget and cost projection. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go over these slides because the co-chairs and Ray were the people in the room when we in the building committee were in the room when we discussed this. And these are the options that HMFH developed, and we were concerned with options 1 and 2. They really didn't provide that much of as much as we needed. We believe that option 3 and 4, which were 2 starred and 3 starred, where you get 271 million versus 348. And then we decided those were not as palatable as we would like them to be. So we looked at a 4th option, which was to take the Cypress building by eminent domain and build over the tracks. And that gave us a basic project cost of 149.9. Next slide, please. But no, But when if you look on the left-hand side, but when we added the site acquisition, Cypress Field, MBTA costs, some more escalation, swing space cost, and station renovation and plaza, we came to the in the middle column, the 205.6. Unfortunately, as I've said before, now the cost is estimated at 237.8, which is the $32 million we're talking about in bonds here. Next slide. Okay, Andy, you want to take this over? This is again a breakdown of just how those costs came out. We got to 205.6 in 2018 town meeting. Next.
Take it over here, Nancy.
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks everyone. Good evening. So to further summarize where the project continued on since the town vote in May 2018, the team, design team, architect, and the construction managers did an estimate late December of 18 into January, where we did what's called a design development estimate as the time progressed on the project. At the time, the estimated construction costs came in slightly over the budget at 130 million, and we were able to come up with what's called value management suggestions on ways to reduce scope, not affect program overly, but yet still accomplish the same goal of the cost of the project. And at that time, we came up with about 47 or so ideas that were accepted. A lot more were on the list, but about 47 were accepted. That got us back to the budget of 205.6. As the year continued last year, we went into what's called the 60% level design of completion in May of 2019. We had a hard cost that went up again, and the additional list of value management options of about 43 or so items were also presented, almost got us back to the budget, but yet we were able to adjust other soft costs in order to offset the increase in the hard costs due to other areas of the budget that revealed themselves to not need as much. So we essentially reallocated some costs at the time to still stay with the 205.6 budget. So the majority of the projects started bidding summer last year, with the bulk of the design having been completed in August, and then going into full bidding for the balance of the two Cypress building, now known as 22 Tappan, as well as the STEM building on the main part of the campus, as well as the MBTA station work. All of that work went out to bid between summer, approved as has been presented to you all in past select board meetings as these incremental pre-GMPs to Skanska's contract. As we started seeing the net results of those bids come in throughout the fall, the trend never declined. It continued to escalate far further up than we had estimated based on market conditions that came through. And when Skanska presented their draft DMP to us in February of this year, we've collected all the data just before the warrant article was issued, and we realized that there was not enough in the funds to proceed with Tappan third floor deferred maintenance streetscapes, as was estimated back at the 60% phase due to the increased cost just to Cypress STEM and the MBTA portion of the project. And the other adjustments that we were still able to further make to soft costs where necessary to still keep it at 237.8. Unfortunately, all of that happens right before COVID hit us, and the stay-at-home orders began mid-March, as we all know, and that continued subsequently to this to the effect both the construction schedule and the construction costs that are outside of these numbers that were placed into the warrant article. What's changed? Primarily 5 categories of items that added to those, as we've mentioned, the escalation in the construction market, not just on this project, but in other areas of construction, and it varies on the conditions, the complexity of projects, whether they are urban or suburban project, it all varied, but essentially the conditions, there are a few which we'll talk about. There's several others that happen, but we won't necessarily highlight them. But the most costliest unknown conditions, a few occurred at STEM and a few occurred on the Cypress site that affected both cost and schedule. Prior to COVID issues that were uncovered as we went through both demolition phase as well as the foundation work for both of the buildings. We uncovered these items that were not easily found in pre-investigation. STEM basement level, although this was added scope early on, discussed with the team and decided upon about a year plus ago early on in design. The intent was to reduce a significant risk to the infrastructure to the main campus. Services come from central plant, pass through the old Roberts Wing basement and connected to the main campus. The original design had thought, which Skanska, the construction manager, fortunately studied it and gave us an analysis, although it would cost more both in changing the design of the STEM wing as well as relocating the services. That was in an effort to completely mitigate the risk of accidentally impacting any of the services that had to keep the school operational during the construction and demolition of the Roberts Wing and the start of the construction of the STEM wing. So community input. Last year, there was several public feedback related to enlargement of the plaza compared to what earlier designs had presented, with more parking for the town in front of the plaza. That ended up getting reduced, but it still ended up increasing the cost to the plaza construction just a little bit. And the fifth one is the working in and around the MBTA, both from a building requirements. The design review concurrently occurred with the MBTA. We were required to submit designs incrementally to the MBTA as part of the easement to the project in order for this project to advance on their property as part of the reciprocal easement. They needed to see both the design of the station, the infrastructure changes to the station, as well as the building's structural and other architectural elements as it relates to impacts or non-impacts to their operations after the construction project's done. So we went through over a year's worth of back and submissions, multiple meetings in order to review their feedback, discuss them with the co-chairs. Some were added scope. They increased the foundations requirements for the building as they were concerned should there ever be an issue with the train green line derailing as it's coming around the curve of Cypress Bridge, either to or from the station in either direction. They just didn't want the train, even though it may be at low speed, to impact the structural integrity of the building itself. So they asked us to reinforce more than we would have expected the structure of the building. And then again, site access diversions requires all coordination related to the MBTA in order for us to get the permission to allow the construction to occur on off hours. As you all have heard in prior presentations, for permission to work either nights or weekends, all of those require advance approval by the MBTA in order for the work to occur. Some we were piggybacking off of, which means an opportunity where the MBTA or some other project upstream was already shutting down the power lines. Therefore, we could jump on the same opportunity to do our work. Other times, if the T weren't planning to shut down their system, but we needed it for our task, that was an opportunity that we forecasted in our budget, a certain number of times that our project would have to fund the shutting down of the system in order for us to build over the tracks as close to the power lines that needed to be shut down. What escalation had occurred, this is a relative sample of several other trades combining between the STEM building and the 22 Tappan, approximate estimated budget, 60% phase versus the actual trade values that came in. And it's combined between the two projects. On the far right, you'll see middle, you'll see the delta, and on the far right, you'll see the number of bidders that were invited between the two projects, as well as the number of bids received between the two projects. Some very often were very close to the numbers next to each other. Some were reasonably within the same starting figure. For example, there's one trade that all of them were 700,000. It may not be necessarily what's on this list, but there are many others that we have within the overall tracking budget, both on Skanska's and our side at Hill International on behalf of the town that we've tracked the quantity of bids. Many of them were pretty tight across the board, but this just gives a relative example of the quantity of bids received, yet they were still significantly over budget at the low responsive bidder that was tabulated. For a comparison of the Brookline High School project compared to other MSBA projects ongoing, some under construction, some still in the early phases of developing their GMPs. All this data comes directly from SBA project website, and the comparisons to the Brookline ends up in the middle, higher end of the other projects, some of them suburban, some of them urban projects. But this is just to give an example of where this particular project is landing. Still higher where we started, but not as much as, say, the Waltham High School project. This is a cost breakdown extract from our overall project budget, just summarizing what the original budget was, what we've encumbered to date, not necessarily spent to date, but what we've encumbered in contracts, either between ourselves, the contractor, or forced account agreements between the town and the MBTA, which have to pre-fund what's called a forced account to support our project with their staff. They're shutting down the powers, diversions, which includes busing passengers around the station when the station is closed for our project. Again, these budgets were established based on a certain review of the schedule earlier this year prior to COVID between our project and what we knew our MBTA had for their own projects. We've been in constant communication with the MBTA on a weekly basis as we analyze the diversion costs, which is a significant portion of the concern and the increase of the opportunities in order to build the project in and around the station. As Nancy mentioned earlier, it's a fairly complex foundation system. We're almost past that phase, but in order to actually build up and over the track, we still have to rely on the MBTA. And I'll talk about that in a second. They've themselves have suspended the support for our project due to the COVID issues they've been facing with their transportation system. So I've presented this to the co-chairs as well as to Mel in a conversation, and I hope that we can re-engage the MBTA and hopefully some potential sharing measures. Nancy or Mel, I don't know if you wanted to offer any more at the moment on this.
Well, we had some indication in late February, early March, that we're going to make some progress, and then of course COVID hit. So we're now getting back on track to reinitiate those discussions. In the meantime, we have the Davis Path footbridge, which has to come down. And so we're working with the MBTA and the DPW commissioner to coordinate a larger shutdown, because the MBTA has also a project. So we're hoping to piggyback on the MBTA work and the footbridge work in June, 2 different weeks in June. And that would be good news for us in terms of the budget, but we'll give you more information. Everything changes, day by day. So we have indications that this is going to go forward, and we're pleased about that. Go to the next slide, Andy.
So just to recap on the unforeseens, and it gives a range here of what we've been forecasting, up to 32 million, and it depends on a few market conditions. Obviously, Skanska's GMP is still being negotiated wherever possible to reduce that cost slightly. Bids that have yet to go out happen gym, 3rd floor, streetscapes, which we'll talk about that in a second. That all depends on the outcome
town meeting, and those other sub-projects that have not yet moved forward in completing design or bidding. MBTA, again, a range of 8 to 11 million, depends on how successful we are with renegotiating costs related to the station work and their support of the project. Obviously, we will do our best to manage that, negotiate that as low as we can possibly can. But those conversations remain to be seen. Unknown conditions, I had alluded earlier in the presentation to some unsuitable soils, which was an issue at the north side of the track. Where we had to land the foundations for the new school building, there were 2 localized spots where the soils were just not able to support the structural capacity of the building at localized points. They just happened to be on either side or in between of 2 borings that were done late 2018 and early 2019, because we take a relative sample of the underground just to see what we encounter, as well as go down to bedrock to understand how deep these soils are. The localized area, unfortunately, just happened to be just in between those that we couldn't have foreseen at that time when you take a relative sample of the soil conditions below that. And the existing Roberts Wing structural reinforcing, that building was built many decades ago, and unfortunately the existing design drawings that were available to our team as we started this project did not completely document how that building was structurally tied to the existing to remain portions of the building. And a lot of those conditions, those interfaces, were very difficult to discern in advance of the design having been completed. So as the portions of the building were getting torn down, we discovered more and more how the existing portions of the buildings could not remain self-supporting. They had to be reinforced in order to continue taking portions of the old Roberts Wing down. So that went through several iterations of field investigation, selective destruction, investigation in order for the structural engineers to and the construction managers to work together, come up with the most reasonable solution in order to take the Roberts Wing down in its entirety. Where are we now? On the left side is the original project budget as was presented to town meeting in May of 18. Projected costs as of right now that break down to the 2,007. In a few instances, you'll see some negative numbers in the variance column. That was predominantly for reallocation of some funds that were not characterized as other costs. They may have been specifically to real estate, because in the beginning of the project, we usually simplify the budget as gets presented to town meeting, but we track a very detailed construction cost and budget and invoicing that we present to the co-chairs at least once a month that tracks everything down to computer ITs for soft costs. And that detail, as we've moved forward over the last 2 years, is a lot more comprehensive than this one page that you're seeing on the page. So in that process of reshifting and reallocating some of the funds, it appears that we're savings. We're high in some locations, we're low in some other locations, but it's a net add between the 15 million on the bottom right, versus the -6 on the bottom right. That's a combined net of 9 million or so, plus some other things that make up the MBTA cost that we just talked about earlier. As I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 hit us all, not just this project, which is what we're focusing on. Right around the early parts of March, after the warrant article was written for what we knew at that time were costs projected to complete the sub-projects in addition to the STEM and the projects as were already bid and presented to. All of the trades have been approved, but majority have already been approved and under contracts. The other piece that we did not anticipate at the beginning of COVID is as a result of everything going on, the MBTA suspended their support of our project as of March 23rd. and have incrementally increased that suspension up through June 1st, which is next Monday. Almost every week, if not a few times a week, we check in with the MBTA to continue to submit our request this whole time to confirm whether we can simply push off. Just to give you all a sense, prior to COVID, we would have started the overbuilds, which is the construction of the building over the tracks in the station. We had targeted the first weekend of April. That was what we had communicated with the MBTA. The MBTA was ready to support us. Everything was marching towards that until the COVID issues hit, and that pushed off all of the approvals that we had been given for that particular weekend. Therefore, their staff were unable to shut down the power. They could not provide additional personnel for flagging and coordinating passengers in and around the station. Essentially, that support ceased from March 23rd up until June 1st, which, based on earlier conversations we've had with the T earlier today, it sounds like that is becoming more promising opportunities, more than we expected, to piggyback off of in June, which hopefully will make up some of the schedule losses that we are forecasting currently. Choices to be made.
Okay, you want me to go through the choices we have? So when we looked at what we needed, which was the 32 million, we realized that if we could supplement the budget, we could do it through the savings on interest on the first part of the project. As you know, or you may remember, Melissa Goff and Gina Franconi worked together to issue the bonds on the part that's in this debt exclusion, which is about 170 million. 35 million is in the CIP. So we took the 170 million and we've bonded it already, and we got a terrific interest rate, anywhere from 2.97 down to 2.44. And we had expected an interest rate of somewhere around 5. So we saved quite a bit in the interest bucket. So we would increase the bond bucket and decrease the interest bucket, so that the two buckets come out to be about the same. In addition to which, we have some potential value engineering scopes of work on the Tappan Gym and also the third floor old science. We need to convert the third floor science rooms into essentially special education rooms. So we could do, these are relatively small numbers, but every little bit helps. Then the painful part is if we don't get this funding, then we will have to remove some scopes of work, including Tappan Gym. We'll have to cut out the third floor science lab renovation completely, which will really be difficult. Will make it almost unusable because it has gas jets sticking out of the floor. We have a number of deferred maintenance items, which are usual for this kind of project, and we would have to reevaluate those. We have to reevaluate Cypress Field and Tappan Street and safety improvements. And these things would eventually come back to bite us because they have to go back into the CIP. They're items that need to be done. So if we don't do them in this project, we would have to do them in the CIP. So it's not, I don't think it's a great system. If we have the $32 million, we should be able to cover the Tappan Gym, the third floor science, the deferred maintenance, the Cypress Field, and the streetscape improvements. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to ask Gina Franconi, who's our treasurer, who developed this chart, which is a very detailed chart about the interest savings on the bonds that we have so far put out to bid. And she can compare that with what we expect the $32 million in bonds to cost. And you'll see that we expect it to be less than what we originally told the voters. So Gina, could you go through that?
Sure, thank you, Nancy. On this schedule, the 4 columns to the left show our amortization schedule on what we had on our assumptions. And so Cypress Field at $16.4 million at 4% over 25 years, and then $151.8 million at 5% over 25 years. And so we had assumed that the debt service would be around $295.5 million. We have bonded all $168.2 million, and the actual debt service amount is $230.7 million. So the difference between what we had assumed and actual is $64.8 million in savings. I'm deducting the $12 million premium that we received because through the life of the term of the loan, we will have to pay that back through the rates. So I'm deducting that. So we have saved $52.8 million between what we had assumed and actual. The next column is borrowing $32.2 million at 4% over 25 years. And the total for that borrowing would be $51.5 million. So with our actual debt service of 230.7 and the additional 51.5, we would total $282.2 million. So this would be still a savings. So between the 295.5 and the 282.2, we would be saving, we would still be to the good by $3.3 million. On this slide, I wanted to show.
By the way, Gina, can you go back and just explain to people why you're using a 4% and 5% interest rate?
Sure.
We haven't been at that level in quite a few years.
When the project was approved to move forward, those were the assumptions that were used back in, I think the schedule said
2018.
Yes.
The question, why are those assumptions used, is my question.
That's to put together the debt exclusion back in 2018. Those were our assumptions. That's not, well, the next four columns are what we actually borrowed.
Right. So I guess my question is, or my point is that we came up with assumptions that were guaranteed to be way over the actual market rates that we're going to be paying. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think we should say that this is some new savings that we achieved.
No, we conservatively budgeted for what could potentially happen. It's hard to read the market, especially right now. It's so volatile. So we work with our financial advisor, and we determine what the lowest rate we think we possibly could get at the time. And that's what we used.
Bernard, typically, this is Melissa, typically what we do is for out-year projects, we have a more conservative number. And then as we get closer to going to market, we improve our estimates for interest rates. So obviously in 2018, we had multiple years of assumptions. In 111 Cypress, we reduced it to 4% because we knew that was going to be coming online pretty close to the vote. And then in the out years, we still had the conservative assumption of 5%. And that is the same assumption that we had for the Ridley School project as well.
Great. Thank you.
Moving to this slide, I'm showing our borrowing authorizations less the premium. So our actual amount borrowed is $100.3 million. The term is 25 years with an adjusted interest rate of 2.83%. And our average annual debt service would be $11.3 million. This includes that $32.2 million borrowing that's required for the project. And using the FY18 tax levy, this would cost a single family home $635. Back in FY18, the select board proposal said 667. So it would be a difference to the good of $32. Same with a condo, it would be 210 instead of the 221. And for commercial properties, $1,411 versus the $1,458. So that's kind of the difference as to the project cost for the taxpayer with the $32.2 million included.
Okay, Andy, I think that's the end of our presentation. So we can open it up to questions and of the board, and then anyone in the public.
First of all, is the school committee in the meeting?
Some of us are, but I noticed.
I see Helen Charlotte here.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Do you want me to say who's here?
Yeah, and convene your meeting in this joint meeting with us.
Will do. So I'm going to begin the meeting of the portion of the school committee meeting where we're joining for the public hearing. With us today, I'm Julie Schreiner Oldham, the chair of the school committee. We also have Barbara Scotto, David Perlman, Helen Charlevsky,
yes,
Susan Wolf-Ditkoff, and Vice Chair Suzanne Federspiel are with us as well. Did I miss anyone else? Is Miss Monopoly here? Those are all of the attendees that I can see at this time.
Right.
And so we will begin the portion of our meeting. Thank you, Bernard.
Okay, any questions from the select board? Start off.
I've got one. There's a slide there. It said recent impactful events not currently reflected in warrant article cost projections, meaning COVID and other related. When, I guess, I mean, maybe it's a broader question, but when can we expect to know the cost impact of those events, and when will that be baked in any way before town meeting occurs into that request, or are we going to address that at some future time?
It's hard to say. I mean, we have heard some wild estimates about COVID. In the past few days, the project staff have canvassed many contractors in the area and to determine what kind of costs they see. And they have reported back to us much less of a percent than we had originally thought might be the problem. So the other piece of this is that COVID costs, we don't know where the dollars are going to come from, but we do know that there will be some federal funding under the CARES Act and maybe other additional acts, we don't know, that would take care of some of this in construction. Melissa, have you heard anything in additional to what you told us last week about this?
No, so the guidance that we've received so far on COVID, attachment A from the letter from the Department of Revenue speaks to operational related COVID costs. So I haven't seen anything specific around construction projects in terms of reimbursement for overruns around that.
So we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that many communities are facing problems in their construction contracts. I mean, it's not just us. We're also thinking that the costs are not going to be as bad as we had first feared. It's very difficult to predict right now. And I don't know that we'll know it before town meeting, but in order to keep this project moving forward, we've really got to authorize the additional bonds.
I'm on it.
I think there was another question in your second part to your question, Raoul. I'm sorry.
No, I think that was it. Just trying to get a sense. It does seem like there'll be more needed in the future. We just don't know yet how much that'll be. But I hope that we can get in a place where, I guess maybe a follow-up question is there a plan to know when we'll know how much we'll need? I mean, as this, when are we expected as a board and as a community to get an update on the cost impact of COVID relative to this project?
Nancy, we're canvassing many projects, and when we were before the advisory, we didn't give a great answer, and we want to canvass as many projects as possible. And the canvassing we've done so far, I don't want to downplay it, but it may be de minimis, and the costs aren't as great as we feared, but that's not a good answer as well. So we've had two extremes, de minimis and a great extreme. So the only way we can figure this out correctly is by doing canvassing, and I've canvassed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 projects so far, and I'm going to continue to do so until I feel comfortable with the answer.
And they're just beginning to put their numbers together. So, that's where we are.
Yeah. We've got lots of folks in the call.
It's a tough position to be in.
Yeah. And we've got lots of folks in the call, so I'll make space for others to.
No, Raul, just to Susan, one other thought. So some of this is not actually knowable yet. I think it's probably good for folks to understand that, when there is guidance about what it's going to look like to open back up construction, we will get new information from the state about what it is that, what kinds of restrictions there are. And so I think part of what's going on is that even the reason that there are such wild swings, as Ray was saying, is that literally people don't know the answer. And so everyone's making kind of a different set of assumptions. So all of that said, I think sort of the operative question is sort of when do we think we will know and what will we do at that point? So I think that the question is still valid, but just on the point of trying to estimate it, I think the issue is that it's not actually knowable right now. And so I think that's part of what's going on.
I think Helen had her hand up.
So two parts. One is just sort of a piece with Melissa. So if, for instance, the MBTA were to partner with us in a better way, that would mean it would be less costly, and I assume we just wouldn't borrow as much, correct?
That's correct.
If we need the authorization that the project team is proposing is 32. If we did not need to spend 32, we could do a bond rescission to basically release the authorization that would no longer be needed.
Perfect. And the second question I have, usually in projects we have contingencies. Have we used up all the contingencies in this project?
We're getting there.
We have not. You want me to answer
that? I assume that, but that may go to answer Raul's question too.
That is correct. With the unknown conditions, we still have a lot of risk out there regarding the contingencies, and we're holding on tight to it.
And as we should. I'm not trying to spend them by any means, but
that's one means. If the way we approach the project moving forward, we're trying to do most change orders to be cost neutral, and that's actually working fairly well.
And we're being careful on signing off on those too.
Exactly. So when you do a cost neutral, the risk goes down. But if the risk were to continue with the change orders we're seeing, we want to hold tight to that. But if it's not, that's one place that COVID could be picked up on.
Right.
Possibly.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So I know Andy went over this, but his microphone dropped out a little bit when he was talking about subcontractors. Are there still subs that are yet to be bid, or are we fully bid out on all the work to be done?
Yeah, if you want me to, sorry about my mic for cutting out. I can bring up another slide if you'd like me to explain that further. Bear with me, I'm trying to get to another slide that represents where we are right now. Everyone hear me?
Yep.
So this slide represents where we are with procurement strictly on the 22 Tavern building, aka Cypress, the STEM, and the MBTA. Just in sheer representation of quantity of packages that were bid, the percentage signed up to date, and what's to be signed up right in the middle there in the gray box where it says remaining bid packages to be signed up, and the value of those packages by building just gives you a sense of what hasn't been contracted. These three buildings, nothing on Tappan, gym, third floor, none of that has actually started bidding yet. Depending on the outcome of the town meeting. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Any other questions from the select board or school committee?
I'll ask one follow-up just to the point that Raul was making. I know that that there's some COVID-related costs that haven't been factored in yet. They're unknown at this point. I presume that we're off schedule slightly, given that the MBTA hasn't really been cooperating, and there's been some material shortages or difficulty getting bodies on site. So, had those costs been factored into this 32 million, or is that unknowable at this point as well?
That's unknowable again, because all of this happened after the warrant article went in. As an example, what Nancy mentioned earlier are some progress in the discussion with the MBTA. Just to give you a sense, the original Cypress building construction was assumed to take 5 weekends in chunks to do the steps. If the MBTA and our team and the Footbridge team coordinate to take full advantage of the 7 weeks straight of full 24 hours, 7 days a week, Skanska could significantly pick up that time in order to save schedule, as well as that would be an opportunity. We've been told so far that the T would pick up on those costs. Right now, the budget that we put to 32 million, we assumed we'd have to pay for those 5 weekends at 200,000 roughly a weekend. That's about $1 million. If this opportunity does present itself, as we're finding out today, and we'll find out some more tomorrow, that could be $1 million that we don't actually end up spending, but it's in the forecast right now. And it would save time if we can make this work based on the T's apparent improved cooperation with our project. So that's why Nancy alluded, a lot of these are still moving parts.
This is Susan. One other note, this is not a question, but just something that folks should be aware of. As was alluded to earlier, the Davis Path footbridge needs to come down for structural reasons, and that is underway. That's some of what Andy's been referring to, and Nancy. The Davis Path footbridge, from the perspective of the high school, also needs to go back up. And right now there is not money budgeted for that. I'll ask Mr. Mason, who is the assistant headmaster, in a moment just to say a word or two about that. But I think it's very important that these two boards and the public understand the role that the Davis Path footbridge does play in the safety for the high school students who are using Old Lincoln School, and we will now be using it for 1 more year. Again, as was alluded to earlier with the schedule change. And so using, of course, we will, there's a small likelihood that we are all going back into the building on September of this year, but over the next 2 years, I'm very much hoping that that we are going to be needing that bridge again for a bunch of reasons. But Hal, if you could just spend literally 30 seconds a minute telling us about how that bridge is used as part of the safety plan for the ninth graders and the faculty.
Of course. Thank you, Susan. Hi, everybody. Yeah, that footbridge is vital to our plan for how we're doing and how we're using the Old Lincoln School. When we first started having conversations about whether this was feasible, it was immediately suggested that we use Davis Path rather than having students traverse along Route 9. The sidewalk is very narrow on both sides of Route 9, and the possibility of students finding a path of opportunity across Route 9 in traffic is something that we were guarding against. We've secured and had cooperation from BPD as crossing guards with squad cars there to help us cross directly in front of the school at the signalized crossing, straight over the footbridge, and then it's a much safer, much better route for our kids back and forth going along Davis rather than trying to go along Route 9, which also would involve, a pretty busy and complex intersection at Cypress, and also would involve students going right past all the construction happening at the 22 Tappan building. So to get that footbridge reopened is really important to us in anticipation of the time we're back at Old Lincoln School.
Right, thank you. And I appreciate that there isn't, right now the focus is on getting it down safely and in a timely way. That's important. I just wanted to put back on the radar screen that we have to talk about putting it back up, funds, timing, etc., coordinated. And I think none of those conversations, to my knowledge, have yet happened. And I just need to put that flag up for folks so that everyone knows that needs to happen.
Well, I believe that Andy Papasturgeon, the commissioner of DPW, is very aware of this issue and has talked in a meeting we've had, I think last week or the week before, that he would hope to have a temporary bridge in place sometime in the next few months. And then after that, we think about a permanent bridge. So I know that they're thinking about it, and I think it involves, since this is more of an emergency, I think the other involves more bidding rules and things of that nature that we need to pay attention to because it's a few months away.
Exactly. I just don't know if funds have been identified or a timeline or anything. So that's just the next. I am just trying to signal that would be the next step to make sure the funds are available to do that. So thanks very much.
Okay. Any other questions? This is a public hearing, so if there are any questions from the public, comments from the public, please state them now. Devin, do we have anyone in the queue?
Yes, I'm going to promote Nancy O'Connor, who is the first person to identify she's interested in public comment.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening. Nancy O'Connor, Vice Chair of the Park and Recreation Commission. I had a question and a couple of comments, or a question and a comment. I was curious, and I'll just throw the question out there and then go right into the comment, but my question was on the Tappan Gym. What currently is the budget, do we know, for what is going to be done at the Tappan Gym? As you all know who are on the design team, it's one of the things that I've been asking about since the very beginning. Curious about what year was it, Nancy? 1995 that we did the high school over last time, and we weren't able to take care of the gym. So that's been sort of one of my pet issues, I suppose, consistently since the beginning of the project. So I'm curious if the Tappan Gym, what the budget's at this point. The second thing I wanted to say is, as a Park and Recreation Commissioner, I just wanted to point out that Cypress Field, as we all know, that the design process began around 2017 with discussions on synthetic turf or grass field, ending in the late 2019 with a design, and it's still ongoing. The design met the town's goals of safe and inclusive, multi-generational and accessible park design that would serve the community, the neighborhood, high school, the athletic department, as well as the recreation department. I think it's really important that the park is part of this project. I would not be happy to see it not happen, and I hope that community sees it the same way. The project, from what I've heard from multiple calls and emails that I've received myself, has a great deal of support in the community around. It would be a great disappointment to them if it was not planned and designed. So I really hope that however this rolls politically, etc., that the park is something that actually does happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andy,
May I answer the first question?
Yes,
Okay, so within the 32 million, we're still carrying the original estimate at 60% of 10.7 million for the Tappan Gym. However, as we had mentioned that some value engineering ideas had been proposed in the fall to target a lower scope of work, but the redesign effort I know was happening in the fall, and we tabled it for the time being to see what would happen with the STEM and the Cypress, aka 22 Tappan Street GMP at that point in time. So we will plan, the project team plans to resume those discussions and meetings with the rec department to finalize that scope. Again, depends on town meeting, but the goal of the entire project team would be to further reduce both the scope and possibly procure that Tappan Gym work a little bit differently, still within the project if it moves forward, to further reduce the cost as much as possible. 10.7 is what's in that, within that 32 million budget.
Let me just add something about the Tappan Gym. Nancy is correct. We had planned to renovate the Tappan Gym many years ago when we did the in the late 1990s, when we 30 something years ago, when we did the high school renovations for the first time. But we got stuck with large infrastructure issues, and we had to value engineer that piece of the project out. It needs to be done desperately. I remember when in 1995, when we were talking about the renovating the high school, and Jim Walsh, who was our esteemed superintendent at the time, basically said, well, the first time he walked into the high school, and it was in dreadful shape, he said, "This place is a pit." Well, I feel that way about Tappan Gym now, and I think I believe Nancy O'Connor does as well. And I think anyone who's walked into that place knows that it's in desperate need of renovation. It has not been renovated for 40 years, and we're going to have to do it. We'll either do it in the CIP or we'll do it in this project. But it is not only a school resource, it's a really valuable community resource and a community benefit. And so I really am going to do my part, try my very hardest to keep it in the project this time. I just can't see taking it out. I can't see not having that benefit, not only for the school, but for the community. And Cypress Field, all the reasons that Nancy cited for Cypress Field are applicable to the Tappan Gym.
Can I follow up with just one more comment, Bernard, Nancy?
Sure, yes.
So I'm curious. So Nancy, thank you for reminding me of Jim Walsh's pit, because my description is a little more colorful. So I invite you all to take a walk through there. I was in there in February for a 5th grade basketball game, and it was a pick your own language of colorful words, but 10.7, and it was 13 or 14 million before. Do you know, Andy, and I know that it's still being value engineered, etc., but are we still talking about a quasi combined entrance with the aquatic center, or is that gone and we're just dealing with the gym itself?
Combined entrance. If you want more specifics, I can have Andy Jonek speak to that. That was the intent in the latest iteration that we looked at conceptually in the fall to further suggest some reductions in the scope, not have the new entrance bump out, still address all the concerns that the various groups had, including the community room and access from the lobby.
Okay, great. That's exactly what I wanted to know. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments from the audience? Evan?
At this time, I don't have any private chats, and no one has raised their hand. We do have a couple of call-in users who I can unmute. and see if they called in for the public hearing, if you folks want to do that while we don't have anyone actively asking at this time.
Okay.
All right, the first number that we have called in is a 978 number. I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to provide a public comment for this hearing. And the second number is a 603 number. I'm going to unmute you now if you'd like to provide a public comment for this hearing.
No comment, thank you.
Thanks so much. And of the 18 attendees, I don't see any hand raised or questions in the Q&A or in the private chat.
Okay, any further questions from the school committee or the select board? Hearing none, we will close this hearing. Select board does not need to vote on this evening. I suggest we do it next week after we've had a chance to review the slides that were presented, digest them, and ask any questions between now and then of the school committee and others. Those slides will be up on some website. I'm asking that to whoever knows.
Yes, Devin, I'll provide them to you, an update from what I sent to you yesterday.
Okay, great, Mr. Felix. By the way, could you introduce yourself? You didn't introduce yourself when you originally spoke. Just for the record, so know who the heck you are.
Yeah, thank you. My apologies. I thought Nancy did that. Andy Felix, representing Hill International, which we are the owner's project manager, working directly for the town, overseeing the project, working with the design team and the construction manager as a team.
Right. Yeah, you were introduced, but not who you're connected with, which I think I knew, but the audience didn't necessarily know. So we'll take this up next week for a vote and any further questions that people may have. The school committee is dismissed unless they want to stay around and see and listen to the rest of our meeting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bernard. And we'll be discussing and voting on this at our June 4th school committee meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Hey, Mr. Felix, you can go too, unless you want to stay around for our meeting. Okay. Next, we have a public hearing upon the petition of NStar Electric Company doing business as Eversource Energy for permission to construct a location for a line of conduits and manholes with the necessary cables therein under the following public way, William Street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was scheduled for 6:30 and we're not that far off. We're 8 minutes late. So I hope they appreciate the fact that we kept to a relatively close schedule. So is someone here to present on this?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you very well.
Awesome. Thank you for sticking close to the time. I do appreciate that. My name is Renee Banks Clark. I'm a right-of-way agent representing NStar Electric, also known as Eversource Energy, to present this petition for 99 feet of conduit in William Street. And the reason why we're doing that is to install a new electric service to the Jewish community housing for the elderly at 370 Harvard Street.
Okay. Any questions from the board? What type of disruption of parking and other things do you anticipate on this project?
We're looking at 4 parking spots.
Taking away 4 parking spots?
Four parking spots temporarily from the pole, because we're going from the pole to the property line.
Right.
How long do you anticipate this work is going to take? Is it 3 days of work? Is it a month of work?
Not a month. It'd be within a 5-day period.
Good.
And it's day work, I take it.
That is correct.
And I see you have notified surrounding abutters.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Any other questions from the board before we open it up to a public hearing?
I guess my final question is, if we were to approve this, when would the work start?
As soon as we can get the street opening permit. This was.
I only ask. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I only ask because the information sheet we have called for it to happen in February, and
Yeah.
clearly beyond February.
Correct. We moved the date up to May, so I know that they right now are waiting to do it as soon as possible.
Can I just add, I want to reassure the public that we've had an investigation in regard to the gas leaks in the street, and apparently there have been none located.
Great.
Is that not correct, Mel?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, any other questions before we open up to the public? Okay, this is a public hearing. Devin, is there anyone in the public that would like to speak at this public hearing?
At this time, I don't see anyone in the Q&A. No one has sent me a private chat, and no one in the attendee list has their hand raised. We do have one call-in user who I could unmute if you'd like to do that while no one has identified any interest.
Sure. Why don't you unmute them? We haven't had a problem unmuting people like this.
Okay, the first number that we have is 978. I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to offer any commentary. And that is all we have.
Okay. I will close the public hearing. And any other questions from the board? Okay. I move approval of the petition of NStar Electric Company doing business as Eversource Energy for permission to construct and a location for such a line of conduits and manholes with the necessary cables under the following public way: William Street, as is described here, in order to provide electric service to 370 Harvard Street, which is a Jewish community housing for the elderly at 370 Harvard Street. All in favor? Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. The grant of location for Hammond Street has been postponed, so we can jump over that and go directly to grant of location for St. Mary's Street, which is a project in Boston, but it's going to have an impact on Brookline. So, public hearing upon the petition of Crown Castle NG East LLC for permission to construct a location for such a line of conduits and manholes with the necessary cables therein under the following public way: St. Mary's Street, running through that area to 50 St. Mary's Street. So who's going to present for Crown Castle?
I am still here, Renee Banks Clark, but I was not aware that there was a third petition on the agenda.
Are you associated with Crown Castle, or are they connected to Eversource?
No, this is a different petition by a company called Crown Castle.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Is anybody from Crown Castle here to represent that company?
Can I just say, I just want to thank you guys. Thank you so much. I guess I'm
no problem.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
Typically we would have a representative of the petitioner to be here. I don't know what happened. This is a project, I believe, that is connecting to a City of Boston facility on St. Mary Street where the town line is. Typically we would have somebody here. I can't answer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wasn't, he's here.
Okay.
I just promoted.
Great.
Yep.
Okay, introduce yourself and tell us about this project.
Hi, this is Chris Finneran from Crown Castle. And this project is about 200 feet on St. Mary Street running into the City of Boston property. This is in support of the City of Boston project to service McKinley Middle School. It's a large project tying all the municipal schools and police stations, fire stations, et cetera, and bringing them all onto the same network.
Okay, anything else about it that we should know? How is it impacting Brookline? Other than the obvious.
Right, so we'd be trenching St. Mary Street closest to the sidewalk that the school is actually on. I guess the property line ends at the back of the sidewalk. So the school has a Boston address, but the street is actually owned by Brookline. So we would be trenching up to Mount Fort Street and terminating the trench there.
Okay. Any questions from the select board? Anything you want to know about this project?
Let me just comment. I think, I'm sorry, Raul, just let me make a real quick comment. I think the same goes with this project in terms of the gas leaks. There are none.
Great. Raul, you had a question?
Oh, no, that was actually Ben.
Oh, Ben, I'm sorry. Did you have a question?
I did. I just want
there.
What was that comment?
Just said we're often confused for one another. That's all.
No, it's me and Ben confused with one another.
I'm everybody's doppelganger, I guess.
Okay.
I just want to clarify that that we're talking about a temporary restriction on 7 parking spaces on the opposite side of the street from where the construction is going to take place. Does that remain accurate?
Yes, sir, and that's just to keep the flow of traffic moving down the street.
And then I'll ask the same question I asked of the last grant of location application. How long is this work going to take? Is it a week of work? Is it going to take a month?
It would be about 5 days.
5 days.
Thank you.
Okay. Seems fairly straightforward. Any other questions from the board? Okay, this is a public hearing. Devin, do we have anyone in the public wishing to speak?
At this time, no one has sent me a chat. There are no new questions in the Q&A section, and no one in the attendee list is using the raise hand feature to identify interest in speaking.
Okay, any call-ins we may want to inquire about?
That same 978 number, I can unmute if they'd like to possibly offer a comment in this public hearing.
Okay, hearing none, and unless there are any other questions from the board, we can close this hearing. Any other questions from the board? Okay, no. So I'll close the hearing and move approval of the petition of Crown Castle NG East LLC for permission to construct a location for such a line of conduits and manholes, the necessary cables under the following public way: St. Mary Street, running through that area to 50 St. Mary Street in the city of Boston. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez? Is that aye?
Yep.
Okay. And chair votes aye. Thank you. It's Mr. Finneran, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next. Now we get interesting. Fiscal year 21 budget update. Mr. Kleckner, what do you have for us?
Sure. Well, I'd like to review what we did at the Town School Partnership meeting on Friday, or what we presented, and I want to follow up with this board and push a little further and see if we can develop some at least broad parameters of a budget plan. So I just wanted to remind the board that we're talking about fiscal year 21, which is the fiscal year that begins on July 1st, coming up. But we're also in a fiscal year, we're in fiscal year 2020 now. So I know that there are a lot of concerns about both of these fiscal years in terms of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to speak mostly about fiscal 21, but I will just assure the board and the public that we have a good handle on FY20, although it's not finished yet. But COVID-19 came into impacting this community in the fourth quarter of the fiscal year. And so because we had very good performance, revenue performance and expenditure performance in the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year, we are able pretty confidently to say that we will not have a deficit in fiscal 20 as a result of the COVID-19 impacts on the economy. However, we have a lot less money than what we predicted, and we are also trying to prepare for fiscal 21. So I know that some of you are aware, or I know the board is very aware, that we had to do some furloughs and other measures for fiscal 20 to make sure we would be in balance, but also to begin to think about next year, fiscal year 21, because that is the year that we're facing a real big budget hole. And that fiscal year, as I said, begins on July 1st. Now, we have already submitted a balanced budget back in February for the next fiscal year. And the board had begun to meet with the department heads. The advisory committee and their subcommittees began to deliberate about the proposed budgets. And then March happened, and COVID-19 really changed the world we live in, and certainly changed the issues around the projected budget for next year. So Melissa Goff, our deputy town administrator, myself, along with Gina Franconi, our finance director, Justin Casanova Davis, the assistant town administrator, we've all been working hard along with our department heads. The school department has been doing the same thing, but we've been working to try to recast the fiscal year 21 budget beginning in July based on this new normal that we're facing. And we presented last Friday to the Town and School Partnership Committee that we are projecting about a $13 million hole in our budget. So the budget that we presented on February 15th is $12.7 million less than what we had anticipated. And there's really 2 major reasons for that. The first is state aid. The state government provides aid to cities and towns, and we're quite sure that they will not be able to provide the aid that they had anticipated earlier in the year when we built our budget. So we are projecting that state aid will be about $3.3 million less than what we had projected back in February. The other major factor is what we refer to as local receipts. These aren't property taxes. These are other fees and revenue that come from the town. Actually, some of them are called taxes, but they're excise taxes, which are different than property taxes. And so that's where the bulk of the reductions are coming from. There's $9.3 million we're projecting less in local receipts next year than what we had thought prior to the COVID-19. These include motor vehicle excise tax, the marijuana excise taxes, hotel and motel taxes, parking meter fees, and a host of other fees. So with this $13 million hole in the budget, we've obviously put the school department on notice. We put our town departments on notice that we're going to have to create a balanced budget. We have no choice. Local government in Massachusetts must approve a balanced budget. There is no deficit spending in local government. So we need to put together a budget that is reflecting this new normal and trying to put together a balanced budget, how to absorb these $13 million loss of revenue. So as I said, we put the school department on notice. Our town departments, we've asked to do budget cutting exercises. And ask you, this board, to consider whether there are ways to mitigate those budget impacts, because I will tell you, I've seen the budget impacts that the town departments have submitted potentially. I have a budget, our budget ourselves, and so I know firsthand the kind of reductions that might be necessary. The school department, obviously, we're talking about some really stressful times for them, given what they were expecting in the fiscal 21 budget. So I am suggesting essentially that we try to develop a more balanced plan that does not rely totally on budget cuts to make this budget balanced. And I identified a number of budget policy issues and potential solutions, which I would like to talk a little bit more this evening with the board. My initial thought, I spent a lot of time over the weekend on this, is to try to develop a balanced approach. So looking at potentially some revenues, we talked about some parking meter revenues last week. I want to have that discussion again this week. Looking at potential new revenues, looking at some budget cuts, which I don't think we're going to avoid, but also potentially looking at some use of reserves or a different way to allocate the town's fund balance or free cash that would balance this problem out and make the budget reductions a little less dramatic. Now, I say that knowing that there's no free lunch. Any of these decisions that we make might have some longer term implications for the town. I actually don't see this budget situation resolving itself in a year. I believe we're going to be faced with similar difficulties in fiscal year 22, which is the year that starts next July, I should say July 2021. So I'm really reluctant to use all of our tricks and really wanted to see how things are going before we can make those calls. So let me get right into what I'm like to talk about. So last week we talked about the fact that we were projecting $1.5 million more in revenue from the parking meter rate increase, as well as growth in marijuana excise taxes. The marijuana excise taxes kind of happened to us. That's part of the COVID-19. The kind of sales, the kind of sales that are currently available are very limited. I know you are very aware of this because you had the NETA, you reviewed NETA's operations plan. I think you heard last week that their sales are going down by as much as 80% in the adult market. So very dramatic reduction. And then also the parking meters, we're concerned about proposing an increase in that rate during a time when so many folks are experiencing their own personal impacts from the economic crisis. But I have to say that I've reconsidered that, and I really would like the board to consider the parking meter rate increase and perhaps doing it either at a lesser level. The proposal was 25 cents per hour, or do it later in the fiscal year, perhaps in the middle of the fiscal year when things sort themselves out. So I really would like to hear some dialogue about that. And you might also ask the Transportation Board, who actually had a public hearing on this matter and heard some input on that. I also think that we are going to probably take a little bit more aggressive posture on marijuana excise tax revenue. Normally, we like to be conservative about this. Not only even before COVID, we had the vaping crisis. So the whole marijuana sales for adult use has been somewhat in some flux for the last year. So we want to be very conservative. But the fact of the matter is, NETA has begun sales again. We're likely to see a new dispensary sanctuary in Coolidge Corner for almost probably most of the fiscal year, although it could be in a reduced format. But I think we have a little bit more room to grow in some of these, some of the projections, but I do need the board to think and give me some advice about this parking meter rate increase, perhaps middle of the year. I could stop there, Mr. Chair, or I can go through some of the other ideas I have.
Well, why don't we go through the ideas one at a time, and you can get a sense of the board on each one of those. It may take a little more time, but I think it's an easier way to get people to digest what's.
Sure, I think that's fine. So essentially, I'd like to ask the board your thoughts about enacting a parking meter rate increase by in the amount of 25 cents per hour. That would bring it to $1.25. And I think you heard last week when we talked about that is the rate that the city of Boston is charging. And we thought it was a pretty straightforward rate increase. We've been talking about it for a while as part of our the prior 3-year override plan. But now, that changed a bit when the economics changed. And so I'd like you to think about and talk about whether that would be something you'd consider doing at some point later in the fiscal year, perhaps in January, and or modifying that rate increase. Although, it's hard to do it in less than quarter increments because we still use quarter coins for our parking meters.
What would that be per hour? $1.50?
$1.25, I believe. Is that right, Melissa? $1.25.
Okay, and that's for all parking meters, because I know in Boston, in certain areas, it's like $7.50 for 2 hours.
So I know that Boston does some demand pricing, and I believe that that's something that we would like to do at some point. We do a little bit of it at Fenway, on Beacon Street on day games, but they are doing more demand pricing depending on the commuting time and other factors. We do not do that at this point.
Well, in my opinion is we should just implement the increase beginning with the fiscal year instead of, sort of delaying it. I mean, it's not an unreasonable increase, although, I usually pay it, but not unusual or not an unreasonable increase. And, this is a source of revenue that will be very helpful in terms of mitigating some of the damage in other areas.
So I just wanted to provide just a little bit of a correction. So the rates vary depending on where the meters are. In some instances, the rate is $1.25 an hour, and others it's 75 cents an hour. But in each instance, the proposal is for a 25-cent rate increase. The majority of those rates would bring it to $1.50. Okay. But there are some meters, for instance, on Chapel Street, where the rate would go from $2 an hour to $2.50 an hour. And this is based on recommendations from the transportation administrator.
Are those Chapel Street meters at the MBTA station, or are they along the street?
It's both.
Both?
Yeah, they're in the vicinity of the T. I believe we have some long-term meters with different rates along Brookline Avenue near Longwood Medical Center also. But so I was incorrect. So the general rate that most people see is $1.25, and we're talking about going to the $1.50, which is where the city of Boston is, although they use some demand pricing. Thank you, Melissa, for that clarification.
$0.75 an hour. Any other thoughts?
I'll try to be brief. I would like to hear more about the option to do variable pricing or some sort of transportation demand. I would really like a memo put together by our very good transportation director or administrator, so that we're not just delaying or we're not doing something kind of across the board. I think each area in town is sensitive, and we need to understand the unique circumstances.
Wouldn't those unique circumstances be built into our current rates? In some areas, why not? In some areas it's 75 cents now. Other areas it's $1.25, and areas like Chapel Street it's $2.50.
True. We've done spot based on geography and a little bit of demand, but true variable or transportation demand takes into account a lot more factors,
Okay.
including season.
Okay, but I guess, you know, we're looking to give some guidance to Mel. That looks like a long-term project beyond, you know, the time that we want to give guidance to Mel.
Well, I hope that we have at least a week where we could try to get some more information and make a better decision.
Okay.
Well,
And you
I
can
don't
do that
object
with-
to getting more information, but I do think we ought to head in the direction of increasing parking meter rates. I think, you know, being competitive with Boston is certainly a good reason to go ahead, especially because now we do need the revenue. I'd also like to bring up the issue, if this is an okay time to do that, as to why, you know, our continuing non-enforcement of the overnight parking ban and the parking meters to begin with. I do think that it's time, and the 2-hour rule, I think it's time we went back to that. I'm getting emails from residents who are complaining about it. But I do think, you know, again, that's hurting our revenue, and we should take advantage of the fact that, you know, we always depended upon that revenue, and if we continue to cut it off, it's not going to do us much good. So I think we need to go back to the parking rules that we had.
And the revenue would be,
Enforcement.
yeah, the revenue would be tickets for violating the overnight parking ban. I mean, there are other reasons for reconsidering that. I don't know if that's something to take up right now, but you know, there are other reasons. Yeah.
That is on our agenda, actually, under COVID. So we're talking parking enforcement.
Okay.
And
that's right.
In that discussion. So, you know, I'm assuming, obviously, that we're going to start enforcement, or else why would anybody pay the rates? So, you know, this assumes that we are going to sooner or later begin to do the enforcement. Let me address Select Board Member Hamilton's question. I believe the Transportation Board has made some proposals in the past on price and demand pricing. I will, of course, ask Todd, you know, what to dust off those proposals and take a look at those. But I guess what I'm interested in hearing from the board is whether you would be in favor of increasing those rates as we had originally planned, given where we're at today.
And I'll just clarify that I am in full support of instituting an increase. I'm open to what that looks like, but I certainly would like to have a little bit more information of what the options are.
So just on Select Person Hamilton's comments, I'm not sure that the meters that we currently have in all locations would allow for variable pricing. I could be mistaken about that. So moving towards a variable pricing model might incur a capital cost. It also probably wouldn't solve a revenue shortfall in 21. It would probably be a 22 and beyond revenue raising measure. On the question that Mr. Kleckner asked, I'll preface by saying I want to hear from the Transportation Board about their public hearing and what they heard. I'm also curious to know what some of our merchants say, particularly in our larger commercial areas like Coolidge Corner and Washington Square and Lower Beacon Street. I am open to increasing parking meter rates at the beginning of the year, July 1. And again, depending on what I hear from those two groups I articulated, the Transportation Board and then some of our local merchants, I might fall back on a mid-year revenue increase, meter rate increase, excuse me. But I do think we need to increase some revenue from parking meter in the next fiscal year to mute the impact of the revenue shortfall we find ourselves in.
I'll just agree with those comments and those of Select Board Member Hamilton, and just say that that it's important that, you know, as Mel, as you pointed out last week, the assumption of this increase was baked into our need to meet the commitments that we've laid out in the previous budget. And so I think it's important to do that, but also going forward, this is an increase that will be spread not just across residents of Brookline, but also folks visiting Brookline as well. I think it's a good way in very small increments to make up a lot of what we need to meet our outstanding commitments, but then also moving forward to help address the hole that you've laid out as well. So, you know, I think it's really important, but I'm totally in favor of receiving more information. And I think the idea of making that increase coincide with the start of the new budget also gives people time to know about it and to plan for it if that's something that's necessary. So I'd be in favor of that too.
Is Chris Dempsey in the meeting? He was asked a question by, I believe, Mr. Franco.
I don't see him in the attendee list.
Okay. I mean, it's the select board that would be making the decision to raise the rates. I mean,
I do believe that the transportation board has some legal responsibilities.
Pardon me, Melissa?
The transportation board would need to vote on it first and make the recommendation to the board, and that hasn't occurred yet.
Oh, it hasn't occurred. Okay.
So they took this up. To be clear, they did take this up, and that's why they had the public hearing. And at the time, I believe it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we weren't really ready to move forward. I think at this point they would have to resume their process and and make a recommendation to you.
So I hope they would do that before the fiscal year ends.
Well, I should say that, should probably have said this before, the timing of this is, so I've made a commitment, Melissa and I have made a commitment to present you a budget ideas, balanced budget proposal for next week at this time. So don't have a lot of time. That doesn't mean it's over at that point. Then it's, in some ways it just begins, but I will tell you, it gets hard, to change things around with a budget with the kind of magnitude of shortfall that we have. So, but this discussion has been helpful to me, and I think gives me some guidance to move forward.
So on the specific issue or specific question of raising the parking meter rates, the transportation board would have to vote on that and then present it to the select board. So do we know when their next meeting is, or they're
no, and and if it doesn't happen by June 2nd, that's fine. I've made a proposal, but it's hard to undo it if that right. doesn't happen. I mean, they have until July. You have until July 1st to make the actual vote to increase the rates. But just be aware that if on June 2nd I make a proposal to incorporate that revenue in our new budget, it's going to be hard to get that out. You'll have to make another tough decision to offset the impact of that revenue.
And if the transportation board votes against doing that, it would have to come out because we wouldn't have anything to vote on.
That's right.
So, okay. Any other questions regarding this?
The next thing I would like to talk to you about is capital budget. So we have an operating budget and we have capital budget. The capital budget has grown significantly over the last few years primarily because of some of the growth in our school age population, where we're forced to do a lot of renovations in our schools, and also to lease space in other places that has become part of our capital budget. Normally, lease payments aren't really part of a capital budget, but I think we've looked at these leases, and they're very large leases, as a capital expense or temporary capital expense until some of our more permanent school projects come online. So we've been using lease of space as a capital item, and But there are many other projects that are part of our capital improvement plan. So our capital improvement plan consists of actual cash projects that we actually appropriate and just fund them with property tax revenue, and other projects that are bonded or amortized over a period of time. Now our tax payments pay the debt service on these projects, but they go on for many years, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years. What I'm talking about is significantly deferring cash-funded projects that would help offset some of our budget shortfall. Potentially, some of those, might be absorbed by some reserve sources of money. Although I want to talk about reserves a little later. But I do want to get into your thought process the possibility of deferring projects that would normally be very routine. Talking about replacing equipment, talking about renovating parks, talking about making repairs to our public buildings, very important stuff. Doing road work and other things. But would like to talk about that. Melissa, is there any way that you could just give a snapshot, a little bit of helping the board put in context the range of projects that we have funded in that manner?
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We're all there.
So people who are familiar with the CIP, when you look at it, there's usually a grid, and actually I can pull that up if you just give me a moment, that illustrates what projects are funded with cash, and then what projects are funded with bond financing. And so if you just give me a minute, I can get to that section. And if Devin, if you could give me presenter privileges, I could call that up. Just a minute. Thank you. So this chart essentially is anyone that's familiar with the CIP, it shows the schedule of projects. So you can see that fiscal 21 is highlighted in maroon, and then the out year CIP projects follow from fiscal 22 through fiscal 26. And so any project that has an A next to it is revenue finance. So that could be either the CIP funded through the 6% policy, which is a piece of operating revenue dedicated to the CIP, or it could be free cash. And so anything with a K is assumed to be a debt exclusion. Now, obviously, we still have Newberry on the docket, and at the time that the CIP was published, we didn't have a dollar amount. So you can see we've got some general repair on the town side. We've got some fire improvements here. This is the radio station in all the fire stations. We've got some transportation projects, which are pretty popular, especially some bike improvements. We had some additional parking meter upgrades that also have an operating impact. So we've been talking about potentially delaying that in order to free up some operating capacity. The streets and sidewalks appropriations, pieces of which are funded with the town. And then there's also some state funding, Chapter 90 funding for streets. Water and sewer finance projects. We have park projects here. So obviously we've got Lars, which is bond financed, Robinson Playground coming up. This is regular maintenance that the Park and Open Space Division gets in order to help them between renovations. Some tree improvement money. And then we have town and school building repair and maintenance money. Some of this is regular, recurring throughout the CIP, and some of it is strategic investments based on program needs in the town and school buildings.
I think what would be helpful is if you could identify on maybe this sheet those projects that you're thinking of deferring and a justification for a deferral. In other words, what are the consequences of deferring them?
One of the things that I've been doing the past 2 weeks ago, I sat in on a meeting with the capital subcommittee of the advisory committee, and that is the exercise that they are going through is they are reviewing their write-ups for all these projects, because all of these projects have already undergone their review with the capital subcommittee. And then they are trying to determine through additional follow-up questions with department heads what's urgent, what's public safety related, and what potentially could be deferred and for how long. So that process is underway.
Thank you, Melissa. So it's my intent, right now I'm very strongly considering taking a very hard look along with the advisory committee's process at those projects in the A category. And that's difficult for me because, I think the town prides itself on maintaining and replacing its capital assets on a regular routine basis. I think it helps is so much in the way we operate, whether it's in updated public works equipment to plow the streets or manage the roadway systems, or in the police having police cruisers and other specialized equipment. But there's only one reason why we consider doing that, and that's because we don't have the money. And so I'm very seriously considering doing that. Now, I think in our case, we really would be deferring them, but it would be pushing a lot of projects out. I really don't want to balance this budget on the back of our departments, on the labor, our laborers and the direct services that we provide to the public either. Right. So that's why we're talking about this. Now, I am going to talk about free cash and reserves in a bit. So it is possible that we could use some of that free cash and reserves to plug that hole about where we're going to cut some of the capital projects. But that's using free cash and reserves. And I want to talk about that separately. So really what I want to get from the board is understanding that you don't know specifically the projects, but if you look at the projects in the A, you could assume that most of them are vulnerable to this exercise. I'm just wondering, whether you think that they could be deferred for a year or two.
So I would like to bring something up. I know that it is very tempting because it's usually small dollars, and usually it's perceived that it only benefits a few in town to not fund or to cut pedestrian and bicycling capital improvements. And I think we've seen during this crisis how important the roadway is to vulnerable users. So I would like to understand what the trade-offs are if we were to try to keep that in the budget, maybe even a reduced amount, because I would like to see whether or not we can put off tree plantings for a year, something else that ensures that we are taking care of these vital pathways to essential businesses. And as the weather gets warmer, they're going to be even more vital.
It's an important comment. It also raises the issue that whatever cuts we make, someone is going to be viewing that as affecting a vital project. You mentioned tree plantings. There are people in town who would see that as a vital project, more important than pedestrian and bicycle. So all that to say that this is going to be a very difficult process. But the more information we have, the more or the better we can make our decisions.
I'd like to respond to Select Board Member Hamilton. I definitely understand where you're coming from. I think Bernard's right. One of the things that we're going to do with our budget, our revised budget, is provide levels of priorities. So in other words, if we get more money or there's less money, we're going to try to give you at least some ideas of what the trade-offs are. If you're going to ask me how much, what's the trade-off for, whatever, a $50,000 bike project, it's kind of hard to say. I will be able to tell you what some of the other reductions that would have to be made for a cut of that magnitude, in some sense. You won't have that before the budget is put together. But I don't know. The capital is something that we've done consistently. In fiscal 21, our original budget, we actually were going to spend $4 million. We are spending $4 million more than our 7.5% capital policy. So over the last few years, we've really put a lot in capital for the reasons I mentioned. And in times like this, I think we're going to have to cut back.
My question is about exactly how much are you thinking we might need to cut back? Are we talking $1 million? What does that look like? It's the big number.
I was thinking a lot more than that, $2.5 million.
Capital project. Right. So what? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, just for magnitude, our normal capital budget is about $4 or $5 million each year.
You're thinking about the revenue finance piece coming from the operating budget, and then when you add free cash to that, it's about $8 million in fiscal 21.
Thank you.
You're talking about a 25% cut.
And just that certainly won't come from one project, which means there are going to be multiple. If you go this route, or if we go this route, there'll be multiple projects impacting multiple constituencies, certainly, that are impacted by this for sure.
Right.
So let me come at this from the policy standpoint. So our policy calls for the sort of waterfall of free cash. And right now, Mel just alluded to this, we're using about $4.1 million for special, to bulk up the CIP. And that falls under special use number 6. I would be okay with dialing back that additional allocation, that $4.1 million allocation for use for special use, and redeploy it towards shoring up the operating budget, or making sure that the sort of core municipal services continue to be delivered, and that we're not forced to choose between labor and capital projects.
I think if we start at the top of the waterfall, we're not going to get to the special projects. There won't be any money left. Am I stating that correctly?
No, Melissa, why don't you put the free cash allocation
Sure.
formula up? But no, I think the
if we're going to reduce the amount going into appropriated budget reserve, for example, and all the others above the special purposes, if we have any money left over for these others, then maybe we haven't, maybe we've reduced the top categories in the waterfall a little too much. Hey, Melissa,
what's the question, Bernard?
I was just making the point that if we have money left for affordable housing trusts and the other special use categories, then maybe we have reduced items 1, 2, 3, and 4 more than we should have.
I think the point, Bernard, is that special use 6 is above and beyond our policy requirements. So
right.
The question is, how much do we want to potentially redirect in other areas of that special use number 6?
Okay, so, that's one way of looking at it. I thought that 5 and 6 were residual categories. After we paid 1, 2, 3, and 4, anything left over could go to 5 and 6.
Yes.
So five is up on top.
Okay. Okay, so that's a required contribution. Okay.
So this chart shows is the initial proposed from FY21. And after we do everything that we're supposed to under the policy, we still have an additional amount of free cash, which was proposed to be dedicated to the CIP in the amount of roughly $4.1 million. So the point I was trying to make is that roughly $4.1 million, which we had proposed to dedicate to the CIP under Special Use 6, I would support taking a portion of that and redeploying it to shore up the operating budget.
That sounds reasonable to me. You know, we're not going to be happy with anything we have to cut. It's going to be painful no matter what we do. But we have to start somewhere.
Maybe we can keep this slide up because the next thing I do want to talk about are free cash and reserves. So let me walk through this a little bit with you. So free cash, I mentioned last week, it's essentially the town's fund balance from the prior fiscal year, and the state then goes through a process to determine how much of it is really certified to be used by a city or town. And so we have already gotten the word from the Department of Revenue that we had $14.4 million of free cash. In our policy, and I want to say this is a discretionary policy. It's actually your policy. It's a select board. It's not a town meeting act or a bylaw or anything like that. It's a discretionary policy that this select board has from time to time updated and developed. And the notion is that we don't want to use our fund balance to build into the operating budget under normal circumstances. We want it to go to reserves and to one-time sources of purposes like capital improvements. Now we're faced with a huge hole in our budget, and so I'm considering modifying some of these policies that could help at least temporarily get us over this hump, maybe a 2-year hump. One of the things we do, number one, is we build the reserve fund. That's the reserve fund that's under the jurisdiction of the advisory committee. 25% of it is built with these with this free cash, and then we have been consistently not using all of our unreserved fund balance because for Moody's purposes, so that we can show that our reserves are adequate for a AAA type of a community. And then number B of that, which is $2 million. That was specifically the BFAC, the Brookline Fiscal Advisory Committee recommendation that we needed more. We need more to convince Moody's that we're really AAA rated when it comes to our reserves. And so that's a lot of money. Obviously, we've got to figure out if we don't use it here, where would we use it? We're trying to get creative about ways that we can not violate our underlying policy of using free cash for the operating, but sometimes monies are fungible. And so, you cut in some areas and then you could use free cash to support for one-time expenses. For example, in some of the capital that we might cut out of the budget. And then number 3 is the liability reserve. The town is self-insured for a lot of its losses, and so we have a policy that says when our reserve levels get to a certain point, we need to build them up. So there's only 50,000 there, and then the 4 million one on the capital improvements we've talked about. That's what it takes to get her to 7.5%. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that's a big number, 726,000. Somewhat of an arbitrary number. I mean, we said when that fund balance goes below 5 million, we're going to bring it up to 5 million. And that's the case in fiscal year 21. And then finally, the number below the line, any money left over, which we have proposed at least previously to go to all of the additional CIP.
I'll just note that in terms of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, that's one area that this year we were able to, thanks to the Housing Advisory Board, dedicate some funding toward rental assistance. And so when people talk about, how is the town using its budget to support people in need right now, some of the funding that went through the town to the safety net fund actually came from that housing trust fund, and that's one of the ways that we're supporting that. So if there's more funding going into that in this new budget, perhaps with the HAB support and ours, some of that funding can continue to go to rental assistance for people who need it during this economic crisis.
I definitely understand that. How much of the, but don't forget, this is just the annual increment. How much is in the fund right now? Do you know that, Melissa?
So at the time that we were building the budget, it was less than 5 million. I think it was just around 4.5, I believe, when we were building the budget. And so the policy says when it's below 5, that's when you would need to put some additional free cash. But I also think it's worth a conversation with the HAB to understand whether or not there are any projects on the horizon that could utilize this cash, and whether or not there's a way to maybe preserve the commitment but fulfill it at a later date.
I want to also remind us that I don't know what kinds of plans you have for the temporary bridge, the Davis Path footbridge, and I don't even know if we know how much that's going to cost, the temporary one. But we're going to have to, I assume we're going to have to fund that somehow. So
yes, of
that's
course.
That's going to be another pressure on our CIP, basically.
Yeah. I can't promise this, but I will tell you that, there are potentially some sources of funding for a temporary bridge. And we are going to explore all of those, but I believe that the commissioners at one point talked about another $500,000 for a temporary type of structure that could span that area.
So the stabilization fund, the proposed allocation there of $2 million, that's a large number. And my recollection is that BFAC pushed to have that allocation made into the stabilization fund because they concluded that the town's fund balance was below what it should have been. I'm wondering what the reaction from Mel and Melissa would be if we were to take that $2 million, not put it into the stabilization fund, but put it into the reserve fund instead, which would give us some more flexibility with those dollars. The stabilization fund has some pretty stringent requirements about how you can tap into it and the need to repay it in the next fiscal year, which doesn't come with the reserve fund. So would that be a prudent thing to do to give us some more flexibility to maybe absorb some unanticipated costs while still fulfilling at least the spirit of what BFAC recommended?
Well, I'm definitely, thinking about it, thinking all the options on the table. I will tell you that if you put it in the reserve fund or anywhere else for that matter, it won't have the same kind of effect of putting it in the stabilization fund. It's just the way it works with the rating agencies. They don't look at the town's operating reserve fund as a reserve balance, but at this point, we're looking at all these options a bit. And maybe you don't do the whole 2 million, maybe it's some fraction thereof. So that's something I'm thinking about.
Just a reminder that the guidance that we have currently on the CARES Act is that the CARES Act is for unbudgeted expenses for COVID. So, I think the thought initially when this was suggested was that we would need additional resources to address COVID. And if we did that, it would not be eligible for reimbursement under the current structure of the CARES Act.
Yeah, so we want to be careful that we try to maximize the federal aid that's available to the town. So essentially, there is no money in this budget specifically for COVID because once we start budgeting it, then we will not be eligible for reimbursement. So we're keeping it separate. And at this point, I feel pretty confident that, there will be enough money to cover our direct COVID expenses. And we're really hoping that the Congress comes through and provides either more funding or allows us to use some of these federal funds for loss of revenue purposes, which really is what we're experiencing now. We don't know if that's going to happen, although I will say that I see this budget really as an interim step until we get to November. When we get to November, we're going to have a special town meeting where we're going to know a lot more, hopefully, than what we know today, and probably have a little bit more opportunity to talk about some of the policy implications of what we're dealing with. Now, it's hard to put it back once you appropriate it, but I think in this case, I see this budget really being done in two steps. An interim budget in July that's balanced, at least on paper, with the limited information we have, and then another more formal and comprehensive effort in November, which is still before we set our tax rate. So it's still within the time we can change the FY21 budget.
I think that's the right approach in my mind. And the reason I harped on the stabilization fund is I understand that putting money in the stabilization fund is really the gold standard in terms of the rating agency's point of view, but there's so much uncertainty right now. I just don't think that tying up $2 million in the stabilization fund is the right thing to do now. So at the very least, we should reduce the $2 million to some smaller figure and potentially take the balance and put it in some other fund.
I would like to go back to pensions and OPEB, or address pensions and OPEB. I know we talked about them a little bit last week, and I talked about them at the Town School Partnership on Friday. So the town has a pension funding schedule that it's been in for many years, and the idea is to eliminate our unfunded pension liability by 2030. And we do this through appropriation of our tax funds based on an actuarial funding schedule. And that budget goes up by, I think, 7% per year. It's really a budget buster for us. However, I think it's late to really address the pension funding schedule, and that's one I would like to hold off for 22. I think that's probably a better option for that. I do want to talk about OPEBs. OPEB, we talked about other post-employment benefits, which is essentially health insurance for our retirees. And right now, we sink how much money annually do we put into the OPEB plan, Melissa?
4.4 million.
So the current appropriation in fiscal 21 is 4.4 million, and the plan has been that annually we increase the operating funds for the OPEB appropriation by $250,000 each year.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a big number we're putting in OPEB, but believe me, the sooner we can put this kind of money in, the more we can start investing it and begin to get a handle on the OPEB unfunded liability. We're not even at the point with a $4 million appropriation that we're anywhere near the minimum of a required contribution for a actuarial funding plan. So I'm concerned about stopping it or reducing it. However, at a minimum, I'm probably going to not increase it, the 250,000. Looking for reaction on that one.
I mean, at least doing that seems to be what we are really required to do under these circumstances.
I would support.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Bernard.
I mean, I would like to have a discussion of whether we should reduce the amount from 4.4 million this year, in addition to not increasing it by 250,000.
Yeah, I would second that comment, Bernard. I wouldn't support eliminating it completely, but I think a reduction in the budgeted amount would be appropriate in the short term.
Mel or Melissa, I'm wondering whether I know that this has always been something that we've talked about. When I was on the advisory committee, we spent a lot of time on it, and it is a horrifying number. But I understand that the other communities in the state are also facing horrifying numbers. And the question is, how far down are we on the funding scale in terms of the horrifying numbers? And given the fact that the numbers are horrifying, are we thinking that there may be some state relief for this problem, or that the budgets would just get stretched out? How long? So we have an unfunded liability, but how much do we actually spend out of it per year? And I know we are putting money in so that we can increase the input and beyond the output. But I'm still wondering where we are on the scale in terms of the other communities in the state.
Sure. Well, I would say that in terms of comparing ourselves to the other communities in the state, we're in the top probably 5 percentile. So I think that's probably not the proper comparison. I think you want to look at the AAA communities, and that's, I think, what BFAC has really impressed upon us, is that our cohort is really AAA as opposed to other communities. So we're putting away more than probably 95% of the communities in Massachusetts, but if of the AAAs, I think every one of them has a trust fund and is putting money aside. I'm not sure any of them are at a point where they have a funding schedule already. I just don't know that. So we're doing very well. However, I will say that there's not a rating meeting or a rating report that we get that this issue is not addressed. And that's why I think we have to be extra careful because of our AAA bond rating. That if we show that we are reducing not only our, it's one thing not to increase it, it's another thing to actually take money out of the fund and then convert that to.
On the other hand, if there are a lot of communities who are not going to make the 2030 deadline for full funding, what's going to happen? My fear is that we'll make it and other communities won't, and then they'll get a big infusion from the state and we won't. So at some point, there are some fairness factors here that we need to look at. So I agree with you about AAA. I certainly don't want to jeopardize that. And I know it's a guessing game, and we're never, but I just want us to understand that I think that's a possibility. I mean, look at the whole county issue. When the counties who were managed badly failed, the state took them over. And so, and yet Norfolk County, which was managed well, is going forward with not that kind of state aid. So there's a fairness factor, it seems to me. I sort of analogize it to that, but
the pension schedule. This pension has a schedule, not OPEB.
Not yet.
But so I want to focus on OPEB.
I would like to speak.
Applies to pensions too. I mean, a lot of them aren't going to make it.
Yeah.
They're not going to make the 2030 deadline. And so what is going to happen then?
Can I speak?
Yeah, let me just ask one quick question though, Heather. Mel, the other question that Nancy asked was how much goes out for OPEB expenses each year?
Well, we spend a lot on health insurance. How much is for retired employees? I don't think we're only making deposits at this point. We're not taking withdrawals. So we're not taking anything out of the money, but we're spending.
What are we paying? What are we paying out of our general fund for those?
You're referring to the ARC. You're referring to the ARC?
I think he's referring to the cost of retired health insurance.
Yeah. What are our costs?
I can get you what the ARC is. I don't have it at the off the top of my head right now, but I can provide that for the board.
Okay, but it's not the ARC. It's the cost of the other retirement, other post-employment benefits that we're paying out of our general fund each year.
Yeah, right. We're paying as you go, and
Right.
we're trying to avoid that. But we do pay as you go, and we have several $1 million, I'm assuming, Melissa, in the town's retirement, health insurance budget for retired town employees.
Yes, it's part of the appropriation. Yeah, I can give you the breakout retirees versus actives. That's fine.
Yeah, that's what I want. Yeah, Ms. Hamilton.
Thank you. I will say I can support, not increasing this year. I would have a hard time supporting decreasing the amount. There are two things when I think about this issue, and one, there will not be a state bailout if communities do not make the 2030. They're decreasing state aid right now when we need it the most. So I don't think that that's a risk. And I think that our credit rating is the key to keeping a lot of our costs down over time. And so we need to do everything in our power to keep that kind of debt managed.
I definitely agree with that.
Thank you.
But I think what you said was that with respect to the pensions, not the OPEBs, with respect to the pensions, where we do have a schedule, we're not going to do anything because this year, because we need to run an actuarial study and make some other changes. So I don't think the pension fund is really an issue here.
Well, we do believe that there are some potential assumptions or techniques that potentially could adjust the pension schedule going forward, but in fiscal 22, not in the current fiscal, not in the fiscal year that we're planning for 21. That's pension. So I will tell you that, I spent a lot of time over the weekend playing with numbers and doing a lot of different things. My goal was to try to get that 13 million down quite a bit. And I got it down a bit, maybe about a third. I couldn't get it down much more. This discussion will help me, and I'm going to look at some other alternatives. But unfortunately, I'm afraid we are not going to, at least for the budget in July, beginning in July, I don't think we're going to avoid some pretty significant reductions in our operating budgets. And that, for us and for the schools, of course, involves people. It's very, very hard to make the kind of reductions in a labor force that's for a municipality. That's what we do. Most of our budgets are made up of people who are providing those kind of services. So we're trying to get it down. This has been very helpful. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to see some pretty dramatic reductions in our budget, even with some of these other options.
I'd be curious, maybe not now, but in the future, to talk about some of the ways in which we can help bring local receipts back, especially as we think about meal and occupancy and all these other really important receipts for us, and how we as a board and as a community can sort of help bring that aspect of Brookline life back, so that we can get some more money coming in.
Well, I agree with you, Raul, and we have been reading about we've extended our sidewalks into public streets for more social distancing in the pedestrian side, and then I've been reading a lot about communities who are trying to do that to bring more commercial activity. But I will say that I've also read that you can build it, but they may not come. Right now, people are very wary of going out, dining out, and doing things. And so, I've been looking at some public polling on these numbers, and it's not impressive, unfortunately. That's restaurants. Of course, there may be other things.
Right. We can create the conditions. It may take some time for folks to feel comfortable still. Yeah.
Yeah, we ought to get the word out that Brookline is the safest place to go to a restaurant when restaurants open by making sure that we are a little more aggressive in terms of enforcing social distancing and other things.
Good. So just to recap, we're going to meet again with the Town School Partnership on Friday. And that will be really my last opportunity to take into consideration some of the policy issues and generate a proposal for you and the advisory committee a week from tonight. But again, I want to say, this is just the beginning, and I see the fall months leading to the November town meeting as one that we're going to be involved in the FY21 budget planning throughout. That's where that's at. I really appreciate some of the comments. I've gotten some good feedback, and we're going to work with the advisory committee specifically on that capital improvement plan prioritization that you referenced this evening.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else from the select board on this? Okay. Thank you, Mel. Next, consideration of enforcement of town-wide parking regulations. This is what we discussed earlier. It's back. Tell us what we should consider.
Sure. I think we started this discussion last week, but decided that we should post it. And so we're really talking about overnight parking. My understanding is the town, for various reasons, when the crisis, the public health crisis came about, provided or indicated that it would not enforce the restrictions on overnight parking. And, I think it helped a lot of people during a very difficult time. But I do think there's an understanding that, as we start to go back into the economy and reopening, that the overnight parking would be restored, or the overnight parking prohibition and the enforcement thereof would be restored. And then we have the issue of parking meters, where we are not currently enforcing basic time frames associated with parking on the street or in the lots. If somebody parked in front of a fire hydrant or in a handicap parking zone, that's one thing, but we are not enforcing just general meter rate violations at this point. And frankly, there hasn't been a lot of them. There's so much parking currently, but that's going to change too. And I believe that Mr. Corain might be here for this discussion and might be able to answer some of your questions. But at this point, those are the two issues that are on the select board's consideration this evening. Todd, are you there?
Todd is not here. Miles Murphy is here from the police department.
So Miles Murphy, deputy chief in the traffic divisions here. So Miles, maybe you could just explain to the board the reasons why these enforcement issues were abated, and then your thoughts about restoration of enforcement activity.
Sure. Can you hear me? I'm new to the web.
We all are, Miles.
Yeah. Well, for several different reasons, people for medical reasons and the overnights, the streets that were kind of vacant to start with, so most people weren't traveling in and out of the city like they normally did. So if we were tagging, we're probably tagging our own residents. A lot of them elderly. We got calls asking if they could keep them out. So that for the overnight, it was pretty straightforward at that time. That I thought it was the right thing to do for everything else that was going on. So people didn't have to worry about whether or not they were going to get tagged outside their own home. As far as the parking meters, those are those are ready to go back on as long as we're coordinated. And like we advertised that we were kind of going to the public safety, like Mel just talked about. I think it's as simple as advertising that we're back to regular enforcement for meters and in restricted areas and such. So I don't think that's a huge deal. We're just kind of waiting to be in same sync with Todd and the merchants and everybody else as far as when you want to get that started.
When you said advertising, you mean giving people notice that it's that the meters are back? Right?
Yeah. So
what
we did
type of advertising would you do?
Website, Twitter, and the stats on the tickets can show that people know now that we're not enforcing meters. As an example, overnight, obviously, they know that as well. You can see it from the revenue that's not coming in.
Right. So Twitter, I assume you can put signs up around town?
We did not put signs up as far as that I know of, as far as we're not, we didn't advertise it that you couldn't be tagged.
Right.
We advertised it that we were doing public safety related hydrants, handicap.
Is there any message on the digital meters, Miles, so that somebody doesn't put coin or?
No, we never. As far as I know, we never got to the point where we were telling people it's okay to park without feeding the meters. And I didn't see the real need to do that. And I didn't have any direction to go that way. It was more or less in the context of everything else that was going on in the community. That we're more focused on the public safety.
Okay.
And Miles, how about these zones where we've created the restaurant curbside and delivery drop-off? So is it extended parking in some areas, so they're not even close to a meter? Would that be expected that would be enforced in that different configuration?
Yeah, at the very beginning, that was hyper focused, and to be honest with you, we never had one issue on that. I think the biggest impact was the walkable streets that we did, and the negative feedback we got on certain areas that were near the medical areas. But as far as the merchant, I think it was 15 minutes you could pull up. That was that was early on. That was in anticipation of maybe having an issue with parking enforcement, but that never really took place. And we just furloughed, the whole parking control officers maybe 2 weeks ago.
Right.
So this is not something that the Transportation Board or even this board has to take out. It's just a question of resuming enforcement, as I understand, right?
Well, yeah, from what I understand, it's more of just coordination, whatever the town wants to do. Yeah. The chief is definitely doesn't want to do something that's out of sync with everybody else, Todd and merchants and whoever else. So that's why they asked me to come here tonight and just. I guess
I'd like to just get a sense from the board whether they think we should do this, and if we did, I'd like to see some fairly robust advertising, as you call it, or notice through signs as well as Twitter and social media to people, so that it doesn't, people aren't surprised. What other people think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And also just thinking about how this might fit within our own phases of reopening in Brookline and publicizing those. I don't know if obviously we've been using the sort of COVID website and listserv to promote these things. I don't know if there is a future robocall in the works. We did a lot around closing and those kinds of things, but if there is something like that, I think with you, I imagine this will be perhaps one of the most shared bits of information throughout Brookline is the fact that the meters are now being enforced and that the parking enforcements are back. I think folks are going to help us share this, but maybe we can give them what they need to share it with others.
I think that's fine. I do think we have a robocall in the wings. We're just waiting for enough information to provide, including we want to make another announcement about the election.
So I also I was never quite clear why we suspended the activities, especially the overnight parking ban in the first place. Most people who reside in Brookline knew that you needed to have a parking space to park your car overnight. So I'm glad to see that the police would like to resume this. I think that it has cost us some money. I understand, that it was a crisis. And I think that we absolutely owe it to everyone to try to advertise what the expectation is going forward when we will start to ramp up enforcement. We need to be a lot more proactive than we were at advertising when we suspended activities.
I would agree, and I do think that it's something that people expected, and that especially in streets which are near to Boston, we're surrounded on three sides by Boston. There's been a more severe impact. So I would like to see us resume that as soon as possible. I don't know if we have to put notices on cars or whatever, telling people that it's been resumed, and as of June 1st, they better move their, figure out where to put their car, something like that. That's a possibility. I think we could also, give warnings or warning tickets rather than, for people who haven't paid attention, so that they have one bite at the apple. I think that could be a way to do it, but I think that we should resume it as soon as possible.
What do you think, Ben?
I'm in favor of resuming enforcement and both the 2-hour ban and the overnight parking ban. I think that advertising and spreading the word is the right way to go.
So that should be viewed by you, Mr. Deputy Murphy, as the sense of the board that you should talk to Mr. Corain and do whatever coordination you need to take the next step.
Okay. The only question I would have then is the meter where we just furloughed all the PCOs, the parking control officers.
I guess you have to coordinate with Mr. Kleckner also.
Yeah, we need to coordinate that, the timing of that, but obviously if we're going to be enforcing tickets, we need ticket enforcers.
Okay, sorry. Yep. Will do.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the overnight parking ban, again, that's really a question of your enforcement of the ban, and not something the select board needs to vote on. But what's the sense of the select board on that issue?
Well, I've already said I'm in favor of resuming the ban, and
Yeah, I think everyone is actually.
I think practically everyone did. I think Heather did, and I think Ben did.
Any objection?
As Nancy mentioned, with appropriate notice, and if we can, to the extent possible, I don't know how we do this, give folks a sort of one-time warning or something like that. I think that would be appropriate too, if that's something that's workable by our folks in enforcement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. One-time warning, so we don't surprise anyone. But Deputy Murphy, so you should consider the board has given you its indication of support for doing whatever coordination you need to do, and et cetera, and moving to the next step.
Received, sir. We'll do.
Okay. Discussion of request for permit or fee relief. I think this is the farmers market request.
Yes, so we have had a request from the operator of the farmers market, which is a nonprofit institution, to waive or somehow provide relief to the fee that's assessed for using the town's public facility for that purpose. When the chair and I met last Thursday, we decided that we thought it required a little broader discussion because if you just start taking these on a one-off basis, it's very difficult because, you set precedent and then, the person after that comes and points out. So I think we have to be strategic in the way we address fee and waivers. So, I'm expecting a lot of different types of potential requests. I'm not even going to mention them because I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but we do have a lot of fees that are discretionary in nature that we charge, and I just want the board to be aware of it. I mean, I don't think you can look at this different than the discussion we just had about the budget. We have certain assumptions built into the budget about revenue that are based on fee and permit revenue or pilots or other things. The one thing, and Gina Franconi, our finance director and treasurer, is on the line, but when we talked today, we encourage the board to consider other mechanisms to help spread out payments, perhaps, or create payment plans, not unlike what the legislature did and what we adopted for our payment of our property taxes this spring. And then I know the finance director also extended that to some of the other water sewer charges and so on. So that is the focus I think we'd like you to consider is how can we be more flexible about taking the payment and perhaps timing it or making it over a period of time rather than waiving it altogether. But Gina, I'm happy to have you weigh in and give a little context to this issue.
So, sorry.
Yep, I hear you.
Okay. So having to adhere to heavy regulations with collections around taxes, what comes to my mind is fairness and equity for all Brookline residents. And so I just want, as we consider waiving things, I think it would be very difficult to come up with, I just would hope we would think about fairness as we do with all of the other collections around property taxes, excise, water, refuse.
You're muted, Bernard.
Sorry. Okay. Is there any reason why, as an administrative matter, you couldn't enter into an understanding with, for example, the farmers market that they could pay over 12-month period, 6-month period, or whatever, or start to pay in September as opposed to July 1st? I mean, is that an administrative decision that doesn't need board vote, board approval?
We certainly could defer payments, and that would be my preferred method. And we can arrange payment plans and agreements and have those written down so that we can keep track of the agreements and keep a schedule so that we know when to send invoices or billings. That wouldn't be an issue at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think for the equity reasons that you mentioned, as well as just setting precedent, I wouldn't want to start canceling, for example, a payment, for the farmers market. Although I'm not sure they're asking for canceling, but I'd want to make sure that we, are being more flexible as opposed to just giving up, these payments. That's my view. What do other people?
They appear to be asking for a waiver for this particular year.
Right.
Because they're concerned about the extra expenses that they will need to incur. They will not be able to have as many stalls, vendor stalls, basically, because in order to meet the need for distancing. So and so they're expecting less revenue. You know, it's a sort of a waterfall effect there. That's what they're asking. I think that's tough because we also have expenses that we incur, I believe. I mean, we have they pay for police details? I guess they do. But
I think what we
maybe,
experience there is loss of, I think what mostly we experience there is loss of revenue because we are donating the, or providing the space, which otherwise would be permit parking.
Right.
Or
Right.
fee-based parking. I think, and I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing at one point when this was negotiated, that was probably where that number came up. It probably was some calculation of lost revenue to the town. I'm not positive of that.
One thing that I've learned from my work on the Land Bank Study Committee is the more complicated it becomes to try to adjudicate, you know, who falls into what categories, the more staff time is required and more resources. So we need to be very aware that once we start down this path of yes to this person, no to that person, and we increase how complicated it is, we're actually going to increase costs to adjudicate.
Okay.
So obviously, if people make requests directly to the board, I'm going to share them with you, and perhaps we'll have to calendar them. But just so you know, based on this, I think our approach is to offer some flexibility in terms of payment, timing and frequency, and maybe, and I believe the town treasurer is happy to do that. And she does, as you say, Mr. Chair, she does that often.
Right.
When she can, when there is discretion. But some of the payments, as she mentioned, there is no discretion, and so that's why we try to. We don't want to, just help the people who aren't bound by some regulation or something. We want to be fair across the board.
Right, right. So I think that makes sense. I think a payment plan, I mean, I can also think of some other schemes like, a fundraising for people who love the farmers market and who might, give a small contribution, and they could give it directly to the town, to a fund in the town, and have it be tax deductible or something like that. I don't know. Some creative things that could be thought about to do that, but people are eager to buy things locally, and I think especially with COVID, they don't know where they're coming from, and so I think maybe that should be an approach of the various organizations as well.
Okay, I guess Ms. Franconi has direction from the board. Anything else to discuss here
on this one?
I don't think so. Okay, a report.
I didn't weigh in at that point, but I just want to say, yeah, I think it's the right call. It's a tough call, but I think it's the right call to try to figure something else out. I do want to make sure that folks know when this opens up is that people with SNAP or EBT benefits can actually use them at the farmers market, and it's a great source of really healthy, fresh produce and other foods. And that anything we can do, I mean, it's just a huge amenity, public amenity in Brookline, and anything we can do to help promote it, I think we should. Maybe we can talk it up in these meetings and find other ways to help promote the farmers market.
Thank you.
Okay, next, report on the meta And this was not a public hearing. It was a forum that NETA held. I think some people have called in or wrote in expecting more out of this report than we're going to be offering. But at any rate, Mr. Kleckner or Ms. Morelli, who's going to make a presentation? We received the report.
Sure. Hi, I'm Maria Morelli. I'm actually here with Paul Cullinane, Lieutenant in the Police Department, as well as Dr. Swanee Jett, the Health Commissioner. As you know, I facilitate an interdepartmental team. So even though I do most of the speaking before you, there's a lot of work behind the scenes, and especially the police department. Lieutenant Cullinane was there all day. This was day one of NETA's reopening. And just to go back 1 week, the governor's order and the Cannabis Control Commission's order allowed adult use sales to resume. So medical treatment sales have been ongoing. And as you know, NETA provides both. So yesterday was the first day, but today was the first day for NETA as the terms of its license. At the last select board meeting, all we had time for was really for NETA to give you their plan for what safety protocols and social distancing protocols they would be putting into place for what the governor calls phase one, which is no entry in the building, but curbside sales. So curbside meaning this happens on site, nothing in the public way, nothing on Route 9, of course. Because there was no time to update the community, we couldn't have a hearing, we couldn't have any input, which I know is very important to you. And therefore, the select board did request that before the reopening of today, that NETA provide some kind of public comment or, a Zoom session where the public could ask questions, where NETA could talk about its plan, and where staff, in particular, the police department, could address the many concerns. So that did take place. I also want to say that Mr. Kleckner did provide an advanced communication which summarized the plan that was presented, and that was actually very helpful for the community to have before the Zoom session on Friday at 2 o'clock. So in a nutshell, I'll just frame it very briefly, and Lieutenant Cullinane, who was there on site today, could also let you know that everything went very smoothly today. I did not hear any complaints. I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Cullinane in just a moment. But the session itself was about an hour long. It covered really safety, security, and quality of life issues. There were about 30 participants, and all of those questions really had to do with, how was queuing going to be managed? There were about 2,000 to 3,000 customers on non-pandemic a day being served at NETA on a daily basis. And that cap, as a result of the order, is down to 600 for the adult use side and about 200 for the medical treatment side. Those are physically separated. And as well, all of that is really happening on site. NETA is expecting that parking supply will exceed the customer demand, the parking demand, which is another concern, another quality of life issue. And so I think with no complaints as of today, I'm not sure if Lieutenant Cullinane has anything to add. He was there for most of the day.
Yeah, good evening, Chairman Green and the members of the board, Mr. Kleckner. I did get there at the beginning of the day, and it went very smoothly today. There were no issues while I was there. Basically, NETA opened up their order ahead at 9 o'clock the night before, and all time slots were filled by 11 p.m. the night before. All orders were processed in the morning. I think the last order was processed by about 10 o'clock in the morning, so they were all ready for pickup, and everything went very smoothly and efficiently. It was almost like they weren't open for business.
Good to hear. Any questions from the board? I'd first like to thank you, Ms. Morelli, for your report. I thought it was very, very useful. Answered a lot of questions, and I hope we're circulating it to both the people on your email list who got notice of this meeting, as well as on our various websites.
Yes.
Any questions, comments from other select board members?
I'll say, thanks for taking the time to host that meeting. I was on there. I know a number of members of the select board on there to listen and hear what was happening there.
Everyone here just to listen.
Yeah, and I did see is that every question that was asked was answered or was responded to, and I think always just more public process always better than the alternative. So thanks for taking the time to do that. There have been some questions recently about masks and what the messaging is for this newer influx of people that are coming into town now. And of course, I think that's not just about NETA, but we're going to start to see more folks coming into town to patronize our great businesses here, and how we're going to communicate with folks about making sure that they're properly wearing masks as they come into town, those kinds of things. Can you just, I know you've responded to that elsewhere, and I don't know who's responding right now, maybe Lieutenant Cullinane or others, but if you can just talk about what that's going to look like, I guess at NETA specifically, since that's the topic of our conversation tonight.
Sure. Paul, I'm not sure if you want to fill in, but that was a big piece, how NETA was going to communicate with their customers regarding the safety protocols, and in particular the order ahead, as well as the parking situation, that there's free parking at their satellite spots. So they're have a multi-pronged approach, whether it's through their website, their email list, social media, and signage. They are very well equipped with PPE or masks. So of course, all of their staff has masks and gloves, and they will not let any customer onto even the outdoor lot unless that person has a mask. And if they don't have a mask, then they're also they can issue one. The police department as well, as you know, they are equipped with supplies and will hand out masks to pedestrians who don't have one. It's part of that education. So there are many tiers, many levels for communicating, as well as providing members of the public with masks. And NETA is also was very generously offered to provide masks to our police force to hand out as well. So does that answer your question pretty much? It's pretty much being done on a business by business basis, in addition to what the town is doing and communicating.
Yeah, I think it does. And I also saw over the weekend a message from our police chief, Chief Lipson, that I think really expertly explained the approach that our town is taking, the education first approach that our town is taking around folks wearing the proper face coverings and things like that, and why it's so important. I think it should be published full page in the Brookline tab. It was just so well done, the way that he responded to all the very important concerns that residents have brought up. So anything we can do to help share Chief Lipson's words, I think would be really important.
The police department has been really invaluable. Lieutenant Cullinane has a very robust communication channel, as does NETA. It's been quite a partnership. NETA did put together a very well thought out plan. It was great that, really on a dime, they were able to convey that in advance to the select board. And then even just communicating that plan in advance to the public, it really made for a very smooth first day. We were really concerned, but just really happy that it was a very smooth first day reopening.
Furthermore, to add, I don't feel that we're going to have any bumps in the road going forward either, because they are capped at the 600 patient customer limit. They met that today without any issue. So it's not going to be like this weekend we're going to have an influx, because once the time slots are reserved, they're reserved, and people can't get on their site to order until the next night. So I think they have a pretty good system in place. And we had no problems with PPEs today or social spacing. People were not queuing on the sidewalks waiting for a lot of time slots. They were told to move along, go back to their cars. If they there was one person that didn't really want to do that, and they were told that they wouldn't be serviced by Neta at all if they continued to queue on the sidewalk, and they left. So things are going very smoothly. Neta has a good plan. Their staff is up to speed on it, and I couldn't ask for more cooperation than I'm getting as far as the details and everything else goes, private police details.
Let me ask you, are customers are driving up, and are they parking in the neighborhood? Are they sitting? Is somebody in their car sitting in front of Neta idling, which we don't want? You know, that kind of thing.
That's a very good question, and the answer to that is the way they have it structured out now with the limited amount of people coming to the dispensary. They're advertising the free parking in Homewood Suites, which was mentioned by a person on the call the other day, a resident, because we didn't mention prior to that there was free. So people would automatically assume they'd have to pay to park there, but that's not the case. So they're getting the word out there. They have adequate parking for the clientele that they're servicing at this moment. So I don't see there being any big issues with like the Walnut Street area or Upland Road. I think for the most part, people will find parking in the garage or on Route 9.
Let me just add, customers coming to Neta at least have a connection to Neta, who is attempting to enforce the requirements of Brookline with respect to masks and social distancing. I think we also should be aware of the fact that, with the opening up of the economy across the state, we're going to get a lot of people coming in from Boston, where maybe the mask mandate is not as strong. So I think that, and they're not going to have any connection with the company or anyone else who can encourage them to put a mask on. So I just say that, to indicate that I hope that we are, increasing our educational efforts, making available masks to areas adjacent to Boston, where I think we're going to have some real problems. I see it at Olmsted Park. I don't know where people come from, but my guess is, based on where their direction from which they're coming, that a lot of people without masks are Boston residents. So. That's not an anti-Boston comment.
No.
I'm just saying that.
No, I think just to say that I feel, Chief Lipson's, commentary and the fact that the police force is providing education and they're equipped with masks to hand them out. That's a really community-friendly thing to do. So we do have a lot of police details certainly in this area regard to Neta, thanks to Lieutenant Cullinane, and so it's great to have the walking beats. And that just really, I think, just helps reinforce really the measures we need to take to keep the public safe.
Right.
Maybe, Bernard, in connection with Olmsted Park, we could put, especially vigilant in putting up signs saying that face masks are mandatory in Brookline, especially near the parks that are bordering with Boston, where people may not have gotten the message. So they, that's something aside from this issue, but I do think it would be an important step for us to take.
Yeah, by the way, there are a number of signs in that area that apparently are the result of cooperation between Boston and Brookline's Parks and Rec division. So, that's really great that we're working with Boston in an area like this to address a problem that we both have. So, any further questions or discussion of Ms. Morelli's report?
I'll just say it sounds like it went well today, and I'll thank Neta for their partnership and working with us to try and make sure that everything's going smoothly. Hopefully that partnership will continue going forward.
Yep.
Agreed.
And a model for other businesses that will be opening up. For example, Sanctuary, which will be open up in a couple of months. So, we have a good foundation for a good working relationship with them.
Correct.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Ms. Borelli.
Thank you.
Boards and commissions appointments. Ms. Yes.
I'm sorry. Before we move on from COVID, can I ask a question about and specifically since we have Dr. Jett on, I guess I'll ask it. It's not related to NETA, so those folks can go. Okay. It's actually about benches in parks and our public spaces. I got an email earlier today from Erin Galentine, who's our director for Parks and Open Space, indicating that as part of the state's reopening plan, phase 1, which we're currently in right now, that we're starting to open up park furniture, those benches, and staff are going through the parks, removing caution tape and signage on the park benches and picnic tables. In the few circumstances where there are clusters of picnic tables, we're going to keep enough closed to allow for some social distancing, because picnic areas are only supposed to be used by small group or same household during phase 1. I wanted to give Dr. Jett an opportunity to talk about benches a little bit. I know last year we added some new benches to our public ways, in particular to allow our elders and folks with disabilities an opportunity during their walks to pause and stop and take a break. But also those are the folks who are most at risk from the most harmful effects related to COVID. So I just want to see if you could just tell us how to think through these benches being open, how should we be using them, if at all, who should be using them, those kinds of things. Just help us out with that.
Well, so I've read all the guidance from CDC and what the state health department has put out. And in terms of opening parks, et cetera, playgrounds, there wasn't much mention about benches. I think the most effective thing that I've heard was making sure you have appropriate way to sanitize and ensure people are doing social distancing and do not go to the areas if they are sick. I think the key to this is, and I'm very concerned once we begin to open up some of these areas, is how do we monitor it? What I've noticed happening in other communities where people are starting to gather, I hope it doesn't happen. I just think that, we will see an influx of cases. I think the longer we are in COVID mode, the more people will disregard face masks and social distance. And it's already apparent. I've seen it across the nation. So, I applaud that we need to open it. And, we worked on a plan for farmers market. I was very concerned about farmers market. But I understand that a lot of people go to farmers market because the produce are cheaper. People are able to use SNAP. And I don't know if everybody knows this, but, we have donated funds to farmers market 2 years ago. We gave them a stipend of $400 to operate. So they don't make a lot of money. But anytime you have a crowd, close proximity, whether it be benches or whether it be tables, somehow we have to have the ability to monitor it or section off certain areas. And I expressed the same thing to Ms. Galentine that, as we proceed through this, we have to have a way to clean on a consistent basis and some way to monitor people. Because what we're looking for is how to monitor people's behavior. And there's only so much we can do through education and signage. Somehow we have to have people on the ground to be able to do that.
So at this point, it is okay for folks to be sitting on a bed. I just want to make sure, especially because when I read that letter from the police chief and talked about the sheer volume of calls that they were getting about folks calling about other people's compliance with the state regulations and those here at Brookline. Can we be clear about whether or not it's okay for someone to be sitting on a bench? Yeah. And then of course we want folks to be vigilant about touching of surfaces and things like that. Is that right?
It is okay for people to sit on the bench, especially as the temperatures begin to rise. Because ultraviolet is going to kill anything. Some of the adage that came out first with CDC about stuff remaining on the surface for a long time, they have since backed that off. But as a precautionary measure, I still think we need to, do cleaning, and hopefully people practice social distancing. And if they are sick, stay home. Because I think that's the key. If they are sick, stay home. Because if they're spreading germs, we had no resolution for that. There would not be anybody on site at any place in order to do immediate cleanup, except when we do town election.
Yeah, I think the science also is suggesting that people's bottoms don't spread much of the virus, and they touch surface. The amount of virus is probably going to be relatively small.
Yeah.
At any rate, so again, it's us monitoring and people being careful and alert to what's going on before they sit down somewhere.
Yeah. Well, people wearing masks and they practice social distancing and they stay home. People, we forget now. In the beginning, and I just responded to some emails. In the beginning, when COVID started, there was no mask requirement, and CDC put out only if you are sick you need to wear a mask. That science has changed, and now more people are wearing masks than ever before. And I think moving forward, I think that's the critical message. People can come outdoors, but they need to be social distance and wear a mask. And we need to move forward with opening up the economy and going through phases.
Okay. Any further COVID discussion?
Thanks, Dr. Jett. I appreciate that clarification.
No problem.
So next, boards and commission appointments. Ms. Heller and Ms. Hamilton, tell us what you have determined or what you're going to propose to us as a slate for the...
Well, Select Board Member Hamilton and I met, and naturally it was on the phone. We came up with a proposal for Cannabis Mitigation Advisory Committee. We did not have a couple of issues. We did not have enough candidates for the Coolidge Corner area. So what we would propose is that as we get closer to when Sanctuary opens, and we should reopen the application process so that we can recruit a third member for that neighborhood. In the meantime, there are a couple of other issues we noticed. One is that in the charge itself, we had specified that voted that an interim report would be due May 15th. And obviously that's gone by the way boards. So we think we should probably, extend it to like December 15th. Happens to be a Tuesday. That I think would be our, the two issues that we saw with it. You have in your packet a list of the people. Let me just say, it was a very difficult decision, not easy. There were lots of good candidates. Really, everyone had something going for them. But we needed to make some hard decisions, and so we did. So I'll start with the village. We picked 3 people for a 1-year term, a 2-year term, and a 3-year term. Matthew Hyatt, who lives on Walnut Street and is adjacent to one of the net-up parking places, is for the 3-year term. Again, this was kind of arbitrary, to tell you the truth. And then Anna Otero, who is on White Place for the 2-year term, and Allison Plant, who's on also Walnut for the 1-year term. For the Coolidge Corner neighborhood, we only had 2 applicants, and we selected them both. Colleen Reynolds, who's on Longwood for the 2-year term, and Michael Zurab, who's also on Longwood for the 1-year term. So again, we need to hopefully open up that application process and get another applicant for the Coolidge Corner neighborhood. And that, I think that'll be easier once Sanctuary is either just about to open or does open. I think people will perk up and be more interested. We hope.
Now, in terms of extending the time for the interim report, I would assume that you should resubmit the charge to the select board so we can vote on it, or you think you can just do it?
I don't know whether we would require notice. I mean, it's not like a huge issue. We've already passed the time, and
Yeah.
no one is unaware of the reason. So I don't know. I mean, it seemed to me it's just a simple step of voting it, and unless you have an issue with the date. But, you know.
No, I mean, I think it's a simple step of you notifying the board that you're going to extend the deadline for this report. I don't think we need to vote.
There's
Unless people want to. Pardon me?
There's precedent for, you know, when
there is
the deadline.
Yeah. Okay. So you want to vote, or do you want to wait until we revise the charge? I mean, how do you want to do it?
I think we should vote now on the candidates. I mean, unless you have an objection or you want to ponder it some more. But.
No. I mean, vote on the candidates is one thing, but in terms of extending the date for the interim report, I mean, I think we can just, sounds like what you're saying, we just vote here, vote now.
I think so.
Okay, good. Okay, any questions from the board regarding the candidates? We'll do 2 votes. One regarding one to approve the candidates or the slate, and a second vote to approve the date change for the interim report. Hearing no comments or questions, I move approval of the slate of candidates for the Cannabis Mitigation Advisory Committee. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez? And chair votes aye. Next, I move approval of the Cannabis Mitigation Advisory Committee's interim report. Approval that report be submitted December, what was the date? December what?
15.
December 15, 2020, instead of June 1st, wasn't
May
it?
15th.
Or May 15th.
Yeah, May 15th.
All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez? And chair votes aye. And that finishes up our business for this meeting of the select board. So I declare the meeting ended. Actually, I looked up the word adjourn, and adjourn means to not end the meeting, but to or to take a break in a meeting to be resumed at a later date. And we're really ending the meeting. So let me use the correct word from now on. Okay, that's the end.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Nice.